the failed ousting President Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who had seized power 9 months ago. He immediately became the interim president of the country and quickly gained popular support by promising to tackle terrorism and restore stability in the country. Traore positioned himself as a leader, committed to national sovereignty and reform, appealing to a population weary of insecurity and political turmoil. Currently at 36, he is one of the most loved presidents in Africa, and many likened him to Thomas Sankara due to their striking resemblance. They both rose to power at the same age of 34, and they are both military captains. In this video, we shall take a deep dive into how Ibrahim Traore captured Burkina Faso and became the youngest and most loved president in Africa at just 34. But first, if you are new on the channel, welcome. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our videos. His early life. Ibrahim Traore was born in Kera, Bondokui, Muhun province in Burkina Faso, on 14 March 1988. After receiving his primary education in Bondokui, he attended a high school in Bobo Dioulasso, where he was known as being quiet and very talented. He later moved to the country's capital city, Ouagadougou, in 2006, where he studied geology at the University of Ouagadougou. He was part of the Association of Muslim Students and the Marxist Association Nationale des Étudiants du Burkina. In the latter, he rose to delegate and became known for defending his classmates in disputes. He graduated from the university with honor. Traore joined the Army of Burkina Faso in 2009 and graduated from the Georges Namoano Military Academy. He was sent to Morocco for anti-aircraft training before being transferred to an infantry unit in Kaya, a town in northern Burkina Faso. Promoted to lieutenant in 2014, Traore joined MINUSMA, a United Nations peacekeeping force involved in the Mali War. In 2018, he was cited as one of the MINUSMA soldiers who showed courage during major rebel attacks in the Tombouctou region. He subsequently returned to Burkina Faso, where he assisted in operations against the escalating jihadist insurgency. Traore fought at Djibo in the Otapuanu offensive of 2019 and several other counterinsurgency operations in the country's north. He was promoted to captain in 2020. Rising to the rank of captain, he participated in numerous operations against jihadist insurgencies that plagued the Sahel region, saving multiple towns from jihadist attacks. His experience in counter-terrorism and security operations allowed him to develop a keen understanding of the challenges facing his nation, and all these experiences would later play a great role in his life. His rise to power. Traore's growing awareness of the public's dissatisfaction with the government's handling of security issues led him to engage more actively in military and political discussions. He was dissatisfied with his country's leadership around this time, as he saw the widespread lack of equipment of Burkinabe soldiers, while politicians were handing out suitcases of money for bribery. The country was plunged in widespread poverty, with the wars leading to the displacement of millions of Burkinabes. He gradually became the spokesman for soldiers stationed in the north who were frustrated over their government. He began to advocate for reforms within the military and the broader political system, recognizing that the stability of Burkina Faso depended on effective leadership and accountability. While doing all these, he gained the trust and support of his colleagues. Ibrahim Traore later joined the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, a group created by military officers and led by Paul Sandaogo Damiba. On January 24, 2022, Paul Damiba led a coup that ousted President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, who had been the president of Burkina Faso since 2015, citing the need for a stronger military response to the insurgency. Ibrahim Traore was part of the group that ousted the president. Following the coup, Paul Damiba became the head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration and assumed the presidency. Damiba promised to restore security and stability, garnering support from both the military and segments of the population disillusioned with the previous government. When Paul Damiba became head of state, he appointed Ibrahim Traore in March 2022 to serve as the head of an artillery regiment in Kaya, a move that will later lead to his downfall. Unfortunately for Paul Damiba, Many supporters of the January coup became dissatisfied with his performance regarding his inability to contain the jihadist insurgency and restore peace in the country. Despite several attempts by Ibrahim Traore and other officers to try to make Paul Damiba to focus and stick to the mission, his ambitions were diverting away from what they had set out to do. The dissatisfaction about the situation was highest among younger officers who fought against the rebels at the front lines because these officers were not supported by Paul Damiba, who focused on other things. In addition, there were delays in pay for the Cobra troops. When the officers noticed that Paul Damiba was not willing to stick to the initial plan of the group, they decided to plot his overthrow. When the plotters launched their coup on 30th September, Traore still held the rank of captain. The operation was carried out with support of the Cobra unit. In the direct aftermath of the coup, Traore was chosen as the new head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration. On the 6th of October, he also assumed the position of interim president as head of state, supreme head of the armed forces.
Odpoczywamy, sprzątamy, gotujemy, spędzamy wspólnie czas. Codzienność każdej rodziny to nieustanny przepływ energii. W Columbus dbamy o to, by zasilała je wyłącznie dobra energia ze słońca. Odwiedzamy niezwykłe domy i rodziny, w których wystarczy przekroczyć próg, by poczuć wyjątkową domową energię. Poznajcie panią Monikę, która razem z mężem i trójką dzieci tworzy pełną radości rodzinę w domu z pięknym ogrodem, który każdego lata cieszy wszystkich domowników, również tych czworonożnych. Rachunki za prąd w dużej rodzinie to nie lada wyzwanie, dlatego pojawiła się myśl o założeniu fotowoltaiki. Jednak obecny, skomplikowany i nieprzewidywalny system rozliczenia energii zniechęcał rodzinę do podjęcia finalnej decyzji.
Dłuższy czas myśleliśmy o założeniu fotowoltaiki, ponieważ nasze rachunki były coraz wyższe. Umówiliśmy się z doradcą z Columbusa, z panem Piotrem. Przedstawił nam super ofertę, która nam się spodobała i podjęliśmy decyzję, że jednak założymy fotowoltaikę. Przekonało nas to bilansowanie 1 na 1 i to, że oddajemy prąd i odzyskujemy w 100% to, co nasze. Po pół roku
His presidency. Since becoming the interim president, seized control in Burkina Faso, ousting President Paul Henry Sandaogo Damiba, who had seized power 9 months ago. He immediately became the interim president of the country and quickly gained popular support by promising to tackle terrorism and restore stability in the country. Traore positioned himself as a leader, committed to national sovereignty and reform, appealing to a population weary of insecurity and political turmoil. Currently at 36, he is one of the most loved presidents in Africa, and many likened him to Thomas Sankara due to their striking resemblance. They both rose to power at the same age of 34, and they are both military captains. In this video, we shall take a deep dive into how Ibrahim Traore captured Burkina Faso and became the youngest and most loved president in Africa at just 34. But first, if you are new on the channel, welcome. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our videos. His early life. Ibrahim Traore was born in Kera, Bondokui, Muhun province in Burkina Faso, on 14 March 1988. After receiving his primary education in Bondokui, he attended a high school in Bobo Dioulasso, where he was known as being quiet and very talented. He later moved to the country's capital city, Ouagadougou, in 2006, where he studied geology at the University of Ouagadougou. He was part of the Association of Muslim Students and the Marxist Association Nationale des Étudiants du Burkina. In the latter, he rose to delegate and became known for defending his classmates in disputes. He graduated from the university with honor. Traore joined the Army of Burkina Faso in 2009 and graduated from the Georges Namoano Military Academy. He was sent to Morocco for anti-aircraft training before being transferred to an infantry unit in Kaya, a town in northern Burkina Faso. Promoted to lieutenant in 2014, Traore joined MINUSMA, a United Nations peacekeeping force involved in the Mali War. In 2018, he was cited as one of the MINUSMA soldiers who showed courage during major rebel attacks in the Tombouctou region. He subsequently returned to Burkina Faso, where he assisted in operations against the escalating jihadist insurgency. Traore fought at Djibo in the Otapuanu offensive of 2019 and several other counterinsurgency operations in the country's north. He was promoted to captain in 2020. Rising to the rank of captain, he participated in numerous operations against jihadist insurgencies that plagued the Sahel region, saving multiple towns from jihadist attacks. His experience in counterterrorism and security operations allowed him to develop a keen understanding of the challenges facing his nation, and all these experiences would later play a great role in his life. His rise to power. Traore's growing awareness of the public's dissatisfaction with the government's handling of security issues led him to engage more actively in military and political discussions. He was dissatisfied with his country's leadership around this time, as he saw the widespread lack of equipment of Burkinabe soldiers, while politicians were handing out suitcases of money for bribery. The country was plunged in widespread poverty, with the wars leading to the displacement of millions of Burkinabés. He gradually became the spokesman for soldiers stationed in the north who were frustrated over their government. He began to advocate for reforms within the military and the broader political system, recognizing that the stability of Burkina Faso depended on effective leadership and accountability. While doing all these, he gained the trust and support of his colleagues. Ibrahim Traore later joined the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, a group created by military officers and led by Paul Sandaogo Damiba. On January 24, 2022, Paul Damiba led a coup that ousted President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, who had been the president of Burkina Faso since 2015, citing the need for a stronger military response to the insurgency. Ibrahim Traore was part of the group that ousted the president. Following the coup, Paul Damiba became the head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration and assumed the presidency. Damiba promised to restore security and stability, garnering support from both the military and segments of the population disillusioned with the previous government. When Paul Damiba became head of state, he appointed Ibrahim Traore in March 2022 to serve as the head of an artillery regiment in Kaya, a move that will later lead to his downfall. Unfortunately for Paul Damiba, many supporters of the January coup became dissatisfied with his performance regarding his inability to contain the jihadist insurgency and restore peace in the country. Despite several attempts by Ibrahim Traore and other officers to try to make Paul Damiba to focus and stick to the mission, his ambitions were diverting away from what they had set out to do. The dissatisfaction about the situation was highest among younger officers who fought against the rebels at the front lines because these officers were not supported by Paul Damiba, who focused on other things. In addition, there were delays in pay for the Cobra troops. When the officers noticed that Paul Damiba was not willing to stick to the initial plan of the group, they decided to plot his overthrow. When the plotters launched their coup on 30th September, Traore still held the rank of captain. The operation was carried out with support of the Cobra unit. In the direct aftermath of the coup, Traore was chosen as the new head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration. On the 6th of October, he also assumed the position of interim president as head of state, supreme head of the armed forces. His presidency. Since becoming the interim president of Burkina Faso, Traore has maintained the enigmatic and very formal behavior for which he was already been known before rising to power. He has kept a tight control on his communication while carefully trying to present himself primarily as a war leader, possibly to avoid the poor public image of his predecessors. His presidency has also seen an increase of pro-government propaganda in Burkinabe traditional media and social media. Politically, Le Monde journalist Sophie Douce described Traore as influenced by Marxism and Pan-Africanism. Few months after becoming the president, there was a coup attempt led by Emmanuel Zungrana to overthrow Ibrahim Traore, but the coup was immediately thwarted. After the failed coup, Ibrahim Traore immediately reshuffled his government, removing those who assisted in the failed coup. In April 2023, he declared a general mobilization of the population to support the military, as rebel forces continued to increase the rate of their attacks. Traore publicly pledged to reconquer all rebel-held areas and that there would be no negotiations until the insurgency had been greatly weakened. In the following month, Traore questioned the planned restoration of democracy for 2024, stating that elections could not be held unless the insurgents were pushed back and the security situation had been improved. In September of 2023, there was another failed coup attempt. The Burkinabe junta later stated that the perpetrators of the coup were Abdul Aziz Awoba, the commander of the Burkinabe Special Forces, Lieutenant Colonel Boubacar Keita, director of the Higher Institute of Civil Protection Studies, Lieutenant Colonel Cheikh Hamza Ouattara, commander of the Special Forces of the VDP, and Christophe Mega, deputy commander of VDP Special Forces. Two other officers, including Seko Ouedraogo, former director of the National Intelligence Services of Burkina Faso, who was fired on September 13th, were said to be in hiding. On 4 October, Traore dismissed Lieutenant Colonel Evrard Somda, as head of the National Gendarmerie, replacing him with Lieutenant Colonel Kuagri Nadama, after it emerged that 2 commanders of special gendarmerie units had been arrested for involvement in the coup. Months later, in January 2024, the government announced it had thwarted another planned coup set for the 14th of January. In what was officially described as the umpteenth attempt at destabilization, junta forces made several arrests of military and civilian personnel. National consultations were held on 25th and 26th May 2024 to discuss the future of the transition in Burkina Faso. While participants included civil society representatives, most political parties boycotted the consultations. The result was the extension of President Traore's mandate for an additional 5 years while also allowing him to contest the next presidential elections.
Makes me feel like I was made for you. The storm in your eyes, in your eyes, in your eyes. You cannot escape from me. The gods above and our destiny. You cannot escape from me. The gods above and our destiny. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 I'm giving you my love, we'll always be together. Remove your layers, come as you are, come as you are. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 ah. Ale, ale, oh. Ale, 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 ale. Ale, ale, oh. Ale, 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 ah. Ale, ale, oh. Ale, 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 ale. Ale, 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 oh. Ale, 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 ah. Ale, ale, oh. Ale, 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 ale. Ale, ale, oh. Ale, 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 ah. Ale, ale, oh. Ale, 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 ale. I'm giving you my love, we'll always be together.
The global AI market is projected to reach $1,770 billion by 2032. Do you have the skills needed to seize this opportunity? Build a rewarding career in AI with the postgraduate program in AI and machine learning, business applications. Take the first step towards AI mastery. Apply now.
His foreign policies. Since becoming the interim president, Ibrahim Traore has made some tough decisions. He has greatly expressed his dissatisfaction with France and their exploitation of the country. In February 2023, Traore's government expelled the French forces assisting in fighting the local insurgency from Burkina Faso. He subsequently declared that, "We really want to look at other horizons because we want win-win partnerships," supporting the diversification of Burkina Faso's international partnerships. Shortly after, Traore's government expressed support for a federation with Mali, and both invited Guinea. All three countries are under military leadership, and if it were to become a union, it would be the largest country ruled by military junta. To replace French military support, Traore forged closer ties to Turkey and Russia. According to Reuters and the New York Times, Traore was suspected of having a connection with Russian mercenary organization Wagner Group due to having expressed anti-French and pro-Russian views. As Traore entered Ouagadougou, the nation's capital, supporters cheered, some waving Russian flags. The government of Ghana publicly alleged that Traore began collaborating with the Wagner Group following the coup, enlisting the mercenaries against the jihadist rebels. Traore denied this, claiming that "our Wagner are the VDP," referencing the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. On 29 July 2023, following the 2023 Russia-Africa Summit, Traore said that the people of his country support Russia and communicated that a decision had been made to reopen the Russian embassy, which was closed in 1992. According to the newspaper Le Monde in May 2023, the Traore regime seems for the time being to be favoring the use of its own forces in the fight against the jihadists and has not asked Wagner's Russians for help. In July 2024, Traore's military junta proposed criminalizing homosexuality. The bill still has to be approved by Parliament, and he is clamoring for the bill to be approved. In January 2025, Traore ordered a ban on the wearing of colonial-style wigs by Burkina Faso's judges. Ibrahim Traore has also embarked on several ambitious mega-projects to transform the country. His works so far has been able to speak for him, and as it stands, he might be the president of Burkina Faso for a very long. Ibrahim Traore represents a pivotal figure in Burkina Faso's contemporary history, embodying the hopes and challenges of a nation grappling with insecurity and political upheaval. His rise to power through the patriotic movement for safeguard and restoration reflects a deep desire for change among the populace. As he navigates the complexities of governance, Traore's commitment to restoring stability and national pride resonates with many Burkinabe citizens. While the path ahead is fraught with difficulties, his leadership offers a renewed sense of determination, underscoring the potential for resilience and transformation in a country striving for peace and prosperity. Thanks for watching this video. Please do well to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our subsequent videos.
My name is Ibrahim Traore. I am a man like you, born in this land of Burkina Faso, raised under the same sun that shines on us all. Today I want to share a story with you. It's not a story of power or titles. It's a story about respect, about dignity, about what it means to be human. It happened on a flight in seat 2A, on a plane bound for our capital, Ouagadougou. Let me tell you what happened in simple words so we can all learn together. It was a busy afternoon at the airport. People were everywhere, rushing with their bags, some laughing, some tired, some arguing. Flights were coming and going, voices filled the air, and the noise of wheels rolling on the floor mixed with the hum of announcements. I was there, just a man in a plain black kaftan. My shoes were clean but simple. My bag was small, just enough for what I needed. I didn't wear a suit or a watch. I didn't carry a big briefcase or a laptop. I sat quietly in the first-class lounge, holding my ticket for Flight 227 to West Africa. In the lounge, people sipped drinks, scrolled on their phones, or talked loudly about business. I said nothing. I watched. I listened. A few people looked at me, then looked again. A black man, alone in simple clothes, sitting in the first-class lounge. They wondered. I could tell. Who is he? Why is he here? He doesn't look rich. He doesn't look like a businessman. But I sat there, peaceful, waiting for my flight, like everyone else. In the lounge, people sipped drinks, scrolled on their phones, or talked loudly about business. I said nothing. I watched. I listened. A few people looked at me, then looked again. A black man, alone in simple clothes, sitting in the first-class lounge. They wondered. I could tell. Who is he? Why is he here? He doesn't look rich. He doesn't look like a businessman. But I sat there, peaceful, waiting for my flight, like everyone else.
Can we have your name, the company you work for, and the year you graduated with your next degree?
Okay, good morning. Hi, my name is Tolulope Babatunde. I currently work with Meristem Wealth Management Limited, and I graduated from Mexford March 2022.
What has changed in your life since we last spoke to you?
Okay, a lot changed in my life basically, especially in terms.
Then it was my turn. I stepped forward and handed her my ticket. Her smile disappeared. She looked at my face, then at my clothes. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, sir," she said, putting her arm in front of me. "You must be lost. This lane is for first class." I stayed calm. I handed her my ticket again. "This is my ticket," I said softly. She took it, stared at it, and her face tightened. "Seat 2A, she read, almost to herself. "This must be a mistake." She looked me up and down, her eyes full of doubt. "Sir, this flight is not for someone of your color. You can't sit here." People nearby turned to look. A young woman behind me gasped. A man in a business suit frowned. Some pulled out their phones, starting to record. Clara's voice grew louder. I said, "This flight is not for someone like you. You must have booked economy by mistake. Maybe someone used your card." I stayed still. My heart was steady. "I bought a first-class ticket," I said. "That's my seat, 2A. She laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "You can't even pronounce the name of this airline, and you want to sit in first class." The crowd grew restless. People whispered. More phones were raised. A younger attendant, a man with glasses, walked over. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Clara leaned toward him. "This guy's trying to force his way into first class with a fake ticket," she whispered.
On September 30th, 2022, 34-years-old military captain Ibrahim Traore and fellow soldiers seized control in Burkina Faso, ousting President Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who had seized power 9 months ago. He immediately became the interim president of the country and quickly gained popular support by promising to tackle terrorism and restore stability in the country. Traore positioned himself as a leader committed to national sovereignty and reform, appealing to a population weary of insecurity and political turmoil. Currently at 36, he is one of the most loved presidents in Africa, and many likened him to Thomas Sankara due to their striking resemblance. They both rose to power at the same age of 34, and they are both military captains. In this video, we shall take a deep dive into how Ibrahim Traore captured Burkina Faso and became the youngest and most loved president in Africa at just 34. But first, if you are new on the channel, welcome. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our videos. His early life. Ibrahim Traore was born in Kera, Bondokui, Muhun Province in Burkina Faso, on 14 March 1988. After receiving his primary education in Bondokui, he attended a high school in Bobo Dioulasso, where he was known as being quiet and very talented. He later moved to the country's capital city, Ouagadougou, in 2006, where he studied geology at the University of Ouagadougou. He was part of the Association of Muslim Students and the Marxist Association Nationale des Étudiants du Burkina. In the latter, He rose to delegate and became known for defending his classmates in disputes. He graduated from the university with honor. Traore joined the Army of Burkina Faso in 2009 and graduated from the Georges Namoano Military Academy. He was sent to Morocco for anti-aircraft training before being transferred to an infantry unit in Kaya, a town in northern Burkina Faso. Promoted to lieutenant in 2014, Traore joined MINUSMA, a United Nations peacekeeping force involved in the Mali War. In 2018, he was cited as one of the MINUSMA soldiers who showed courage during major rebel attacks in the Tombouctou region. He subsequently returned to Burkina Faso, where he assisted in operations against the escalating jihadist insurgency. Traore fought at Djibo in the Otapuanu offensive of 2019 and several other counterinsurgency operations in the country's north. He was promoted to captain in 2020. Rising to the rank of captain, he participated in numerous operations against jihadist insurgencies that plagued the Sahel region, saving multiple towns from jihadist attacks. His experience in counterterrorism and security operations allowed him to develop a keen understanding of the challenges facing his nation. And all these experiences would later play a great role in his life.
Now, you know of Omori Oboli, you know of Fruits Kadivi, and even of these guys. These are your favorite Nollywood actors, and currently they are flooding and producing movies on the YouTube platform. There's a secret you don't know about YouTube, and there's a good mind there that you're already missing out on. Just hold on, let me show you guys what's happening right now. Now, look right here. This is Omori Oboli TV, and this particular channel is doing about $152,000 every single month. Yes, this is the start. And let's just get our calculator and do a quick max about this. Yeah, calculate it and let me know what it is in your local currency. Hold up, because I'm not concerned about anybody's money. I'm actually very much focused on also figuring out how I can generate my money from this same YouTube platform that all of your actors and Nollywood actresses are jumping into right now. There's a gold mine, and the simple thing here is the fact that they figured out that with YouTube, you are able to generate millions of views from every single piece of content, and YouTube gets to pay you because of the millions of views you're generating on their platform, right? And the coolest thing here is the fact that it is way much easier to start creating content on YouTube today than never before. And to even make it simplified, AI is even a huge game changer, because right now, to be a YouTube creator, you don't need to show your face. You don't need any fancy equipment. You don't need a large production team. You just simply need to understand the 3 different AI tools that can actually help you start generating content, and you can push on the platform and start making cool cash like this one right here. And now all you simply need to do is to jump into this free 90-minute training I have for you. I just simply want to expose you guys to the gold mine of YouTube in 2025 and show you how this works and how you can leverage on this to make the most for yourself this particular year. The opportunity to get into this training is very limited, and this will last for so long. Now go ahead, smash the link down there and jump into this training, and obviously, yes, I'll see you guys on the other side. Okay?
Hello there. Did you know that Kano has one of the largest housing deficits in the country? Every day, the city grows bigger. The roads get busier and homes become harder to find. People are trapped in the metropolitan areas. The only way forward is expansion. Welcome to Renewed Hope City, Jombuza, a new city rising just beyond the rush of Kano, a place designed not just for today, but for the future. Around Jombuza, we have features like modern railway access, dualized federal highways, and strategic flyovers, 3 major universities, planned industrial districts, and a western bypass that connects Kano and other neighboring states. We also have secure military presence, that is Jombuza Barracks, peace of mind for families and investors. But this isn't just
His rise to power. Traore's growing awareness of the public's dissatisfaction with the government's handling of security issues led him to engage more actively in military and political discussions. He was dissatisfied with his country's leadership around this time, as he saw the widespread lack of equipment of Burkinabe soldiers, while politicians were handing out suitcases of money for bribery. The country was plunged in widespread poverty, with the wars leading to the displacement of millions of Burkinabes. He gradually became the spokesman for soldiers stationed in the north who were frustrated over their government. He began to advocate for reforms within the military and the broader political system, recognizing that the stability of Burkina Faso depended on effective leadership and accountability. While doing all these, he gained the trust and support of his colleagues. Ibrahim Traore later joined the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, a group created by military officers and led by Paul Sandaogo Damiba. On January 24, 2022, Paul Damiba led a coup that ousted President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, who had been the president of Burkina Faso since 2015, citing the need for a stronger military response to the insurgency. Ibrahim Traore was part of the group that ousted the president. Following the coup, Paul Damiba became the head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration and assumed the presidency. Damiba promised to restore security and stability, garnering support from both the military and segments of the population disillusioned with the previous government. When Paul Damiba became head of state, he appointed Ibrahim Traore in March 2022 to serve as the head of an artillery regiment in Kaya, a move that will later lead to his downfall. Unfortunately for Paul Damiba, many supporters of the January coup became dissatisfied with his performance regarding his inability to contain the jihadist insurgency and restore peace in the country. Despite several attempts by Ibrahim Traore and other officers to try to make Paul Damiba to focus and stick to the mission, his ambitions were diverting away from what they had set out to do. The dissatisfaction about the situation was highest among younger officers who fought against the rebels at the front lines because these officers were not supported by Paul Damiba, who focused on other things. In addition, there were delays in pay for the Cobra troops. When the officers noticed that Paul Damiba was not willing to stick to the initial plan of the group, they decided to plot his overthrow. When the plotters launched their coup on 30th September, Traore still held the rank of captain. The operation was carried out with support of the Cobra unit. In the direct aftermath of the coup, Traore was chosen as the new head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration. On the 6th of October, he also assumed the position of interim president as head of state, supreme head of the armed forces. His presidency. Since becoming the interim president of Burkina Faso, Traore has maintained the enigmatic and very formal behavior for which he was already been known before rising to power. He has kept a tight control on his communication while carefully trying to present himself primarily as a war leader, possibly to avoid the poor public image of his predecessors. His presidency has also seen an increase of pro-government propaganda in Burkinabe traditional media and social media. Politically, Le Monde journalist Sophie Douce described Traore as influenced by Marxism and Pan-Africanism. Few months after becoming the president, there was a coup attempt led by Emmanuel Zungrana to overthrow Ibrahim Traore, but the coup was immediately thwarted. After the failed coup, Ibrahim Traore immediately reshuffled his government, removing those who assisted in the failed coup. In April 2023, he declared a general mobilization of the population to support the military, as rebel forces continued to increase the rate of their attacks. Traore publicly pledged to reconquer all rebel-held areas and that there would be no negotiations until the insurgency had been greatly weakened. In the following month, Traore questioned the planned restoration of democracy for 2024, stating that elections could not be held unless the insurgents were pushed back and the security situation had been improved. In September of 2023, there was another failed coup attempt. The Burkinabe junta later stated that the perpetrators of the coup were Abdul Aziz Awoba, the commander of the Burkinabe Special Forces, Lieutenant Colonel Boubacar Keita, director of the Higher Institute of Civil Protection Studies, Lieutenant Colonel Cheikh Hamza Ouattara, commander of the Special Forces of the VDP, and Christophe Mega, deputy commander of VDP Special Forces. Two other officers, including Seko Ouedraogo, former director of the National Intelligence Services of Burkina Faso, who was fired on September 13th, were said to be in hiding. On 4 October, Traore dismissed Lieutenant Colonel Evrard Somda as head of the National Gendarmerie, replacing him with Lieutenant Colonel Kouagri Nadama, after it emerged that 2 commanders of special gendarmerie units had been arrested for involvement in the coup. Months later, in January 2024, the government announced it had thwarted another planned coup set for the 14th of January. In what was officially described as the umpteenth attempt at destabilization, junta forces made several arrests of military and civilian personnel. National consultations were held on 25th and 26th May 2024 to discuss the future of the transition in Burkina Faso. While participants included civil society representatives, most political parties boycotted the consultations. The result was the extension of President Traore's mandate for an additional 5 years while also allowing him to contest the next presidential elections. His foreign policies. Since becoming the interim president, Ibrahim Traore has made some tough decisions. He has greatly expressed his dissatisfaction with France and their exploitation of the country. In February 2023, Traore's government expelled the French forces assisting in fighting the local insurgency from Burkina Faso. He subsequently declared that, "We really want to look at other horizons because we want win-win partnerships," supporting the diversification of Burkina Faso's international partnerships. Shortly after, Traore's government expressed support for a federation with Mali, and both invited Guinea. All three countries are under military leadership, and if it were to become a union, it would be the largest country ruled by military junta. To replace French military support, Traore forged closer ties to Turkey and Russia. According to Reuters and the New York Times, Traore was suspected of having a connection with Russian mercenary organization Wagner Group due to having expressed anti-French and pro-Russian views. As Traore entered Ouagadougou, the nation's capital, supporters cheered, some waving Russian flags. The government of Ghana publicly alleged that Traore began collaborating with the Wagner Group following the coup, enlisting the mercenaries against the jihadist rebels. Traore denied this, claiming that "our Wagner are the VDP," referencing the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. On 29 July 2023, following the 2023 Russia-Africa Summit, Traore said that the people of his country support Russia and communicated that a decision had been made to reopen the Russian embassy, which was closed in 1992. According to the newspaper Le Monde, in May 2023, the Traore regime seems for the time being to be favoring the use of its own forces in the fight against the jihadists and has not asked Wagner's Russians for help. In July 2024, Traore's military junta proposed criminalizing homosexuality. The bill still has to be approved by Parliament, and he is clamoring for the bill to be approved. In January 2025, Traore ordered a ban on the wearing of colonial-style wigs by Burkina Faso's judges. Ibrahim Traore has also embarked on several ambitious mega-projects to transform the country. His works so far has been able to speak for him, and as it stands, he might be the president of Burkina Faso for a very long. Ibrahim Traore represents a pivotal figure in Burkina Faso's contemporary history, embodying the hopes and challenges of a nation grappling with insecurity and political upheaval. His rise to power through the patriotic movement for safeguard and restoration reflects a deep desire for change among the populace. As he navigates the complexities of governance, Traore's commitment to restoring stability and national pride resonates with many Burkinabe citizens. While the path ahead is fraught with difficulties, his leadership offers a renewed sense of determination, underscoring the potential for resilience and transformation in a country striving for peace and prosperity. Thanks for watching this video. Please do well to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our subsequent videos. While the path ahead is fraught with difficulties, his leadership offers a renewed sense of determination.
You can set a price for your ride. Choose a top-rated driver and fill your life with pleasures. InDrive. Pick who you go ride with.
Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our subsequent
Work
videos.
is a pain in the apps. My files are in this app. My chat's in this app. Project.
InDrive. You can set a price for your ride. Choose a top-rated driver and fill your life with pleasures. InDrive. Pick who you go ride with.
Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our subsequent
Work
videos.
is a pain in the apps. My files are in this app. My chat's in this app. Project.
InDrive. You can set a price for your ride. Choose a top-rated driver and fill your life with pleasures. InDrive. Pick who you go ride with.
Work is a pain in the apps. My checks in this app. Project.
Уважаемый господин президент,
Mr. President, friends, we are very glad to see you. And first of all, I would like to thank you once again for making this decision to participate in the commemorative events to honor the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. I remember our constructive and useful conversation back in 2023 when you visited our country for the first time to participate in the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg. This time, your visit to Russia to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the victory is a great symbol, and it reflects the friendly character of relations between Burkina Faso and Russia. And I would like to mention your contribution, your country's contribution to defeating German Nazism and its allies. Some 30,000 Burkinabe fought with the anti-Hitler coalition forces under the guidance, under the leadership of legendary Frenchman Charles de Gaulle. And now we are united by our joint goal to fight against terrorism and extremism, and we will continue to support the Republic and restoring constitutional and lawful order, to fight against unlawful factions that are still operating in some parts of Burkina Faso. In recent years, we have accomplished great progress in mutually beneficial cooperation in various fields. In the end of 2023, after more than 30 years of hiatus, the embassy of Russia in Ouagadougou, Mr. President, was turned operational again, and the economic cooperation is also important, even if trade is modest. It's growing, which is a good trend, and we need to preserve it. And we will continue to work together on further strengthening our economic ties and diversify further our trade cooperations. And it was useful to hold economic days of Burkina Faso in Russia that were held in 2024. And it was attended by the high-level Burkinabe delegation led by the Deputy Prime Minister, and we are working now on establishing intergovernmental commission. We have already established a working group to look into that matter, and we will continue to support your country in training personnel in 2024 and in 2025. The quota of Russian state scholarship for Burkinabe nationals was more than doubled, and this year we are ready to receive 27 more students from your country at the state's expense, and in total more than 3,500 Burkinabe received higher education in Russia. Cultural and humanitarian ties also play an important part, and it is assisted by the Russian house that is operating in Ouagadougou since 2024. In particular, they are teaching Russian language there. There is a great potential in cooperation in the field of healthcare and sanitary regulations. Recently, on April 24-25, Madam Popova visited Ouagadougou and discussed the development of scientific and research infrastructure and training of personnel. We also prioritize humanitarian support for Burkina Faso. Last year, we allocated 25,000 tons of wheat free of charge, and this month we are going to send a large supply of other food products to Ouagadougou. We appreciate the support from Burkina Faso on many international platforms, including the UN and other multilateral platforms. A useful format of cooperation is the consultations between Russia and Sahel States Confederation. April this year, such a session was held in Moscow with the foreign ministers. There are good prospects in many areas, and we will have a chance to discuss some of them them today. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Congratulations, Mr. President. I hope I pronounced my felicitation properly. For me, it was an honor to be part of these commemorative events devoted to the great victory anniversary, and I would like to thank you for inviting us. It was a great honor for us. And I need to say that during this visit, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about culture, about history, that laid the foundation of the resistance of the Russian people, of its struggle. I learned of sacrifices your people made, and due to these sacrifices, we are free now. And I would like to thank you once again for this invitation. And this meeting allows us to think about what's happening in the world today and to think about the prospects as well. The obstacles that we can see today must not stop us. These obstacles, in some way, they are even an advantage, because despite all the sanctions that were imposed on the Russian Federation by many states, Russia is still holding the leading position internationally, and we understand this. We understand how difficult it is. With the foreign ministers, there are good prospects in many areas, and we will have a chance to discuss some of them today. Thank you for your attention. And I watched the parade. I watched the soldiers marching in front of us during the parade. I saw the equipment, including the tanks that from the times of World War II, and I saw the modern equipment, and we would like to see the cooperation between our countries developing rapidly, developing swiftly, and acquire new shapes and forms. We thank you for your attitude towards Burkina Faso. Today I visited Mendeleev Institute, and we understand that apart from defense and security, there is another essential field, which is science and education, and we would like to see Russia assisting us in training and educating our youth to help us to develop our own industries, our own enterprises. We are free now, and I would like to thank machinery, other types of manufacturing, because it's very important for Africa in the world today, and to think about the prospects as well. We believe that terrorism that we can see today is a legacy of imperialism, and that's something that we fight against. If we put an end to this war, if we have a strong army, then we can develop our motherland. This is why we continue to fight. That is why we have this struggle. That's why it's important to train personnel, to educate people. In Africa, Africa needs a lot when it comes to equipment, when it comes to technology and machinery, and there are a lot of expectations in this regard. And that's why we still need to do a lot, we need to work a lot, and we would like to request an assistant, and the most important thing you can help with is this exchanges, transfers of technology, exchange of experience. We need to understand how we can use the experience and the know-how that Russian universities have, and how we can spread it to Burkina Faso, how we can open branches of the Russian universities and Burkina Faso to be more efficient in the way we educate our people, our citizens. This is the essential task that we are faced with. We would like to see Burkina Faso developing, and we would like to see students coming to us to learn various sciences. We can see great young people in the Russian Federation. Among them, there are a lot of researchers, young scientists, and we would like to learn from you. And another important area is is military. We have a lot of projects in the field of defense. Today is a legacy of imperialism, and that's something that
Did you know that the most dangerous prayer you can ever pray is only 3 words? If you skip this healing prayer, God will...
July 27th, 2025, Oslo, Norway. In a small, quiet room surrounded by glass and pine wood, 5 names were read aloud by the Nobel Committee. But only one name made the room fall utterly still. Not a general from Geneva, not a former president from New York. No, it was Ibrahim Traore, the 36-year-old interim president of Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa. For a brief moment, time stopped. Traore is no ordinary nominee. He didn't rise through Ivy League schools or polished elections. He rose through hunger, through drought, through war. And instead of clinging to power or foreign loans, he picked up a shovel. He returned land to farmers. He built schools with the money saved from cutting bureaucrats. He pardoned former militants and gave them tools instead of guns. And he did it all not for applause, but because he believed his people deserved to live with dignity. Now this man, once called a rebel soldier, is being considered for the world's most prestigious peace prize. At a time when peace is too often negotiated in expensive hotel ballrooms and televised summits, Ibrahim Traore reminds us of something older and perhaps more honest. Peace is not a performance. Peace is a practice. It is something you sow into the ground and teach in classrooms. So we ask you, especially those who've watched the world for decades, can peace still be real if it doesn't come from a ballot box, but from the hands of a farmer in uniform? Is this the kind of leadership the world has waited for, or are we still clinging to outdated definitions of progress? Please share if you believe real peace is built, not declared. Subscribe if you feel the world needs fewer promises and more planted trees. The news broke quietly at first. A press release from Oslo, a few murmurs on global news tickers. But then came the aftershock not in Europe, but in the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Tens of thousands gathered in makeshift vigils, their hands clasped in prayer, disbelief, and pride. For them, the nomination of President Ibrahim Traore to the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize was not just recognition. It was redemption. For too long, Burkina Faso had lived in the shadow of conflict, colonization, and poverty. Once a nation known more for refugee camps than for resilience, it had become, under Traore's leadership, something unexpected, a symbol of hope. Since assuming power on September 29, 2022, Traore has embarked on a campaign that defied every conventional expectation of a military leader. There were no lavish presidential palaces or speeches filled with promises. Instead, there were long walks through rural fields, listening tours, campfire meetings in broken villages, and then reforms radical yet rooted in common sense. One of the earliest and boldest acts of his presidency was the return of 3.88 million hectares of farmland land that had been quietly leased out to foreign corporations for years, leaving local farmers landless and bitter. Traore's decision sent a shockwave through financial centers in Europe and boardrooms in Dubai. But in the villages of Burkina Faso, it brought tears. Mothers danced. Elders blessed the soil. Children watched as their fathers returned to fields once taken from them. But land was only the beginning. In the first 18 months of his presidency, Traore's administration built over 2,400 schools and 700 rural health centers, most of them in remote areas previously untouched by state infrastructure. Unlike foreign aid projects that often stall for years, these were built quickly with local labor and local materials, part of his Dignity Through Work initiative. He slashed government luxury spending by 60%, eliminated non-essential travel, and reduced the salaries of top ministers. The money saved was poured into rural education and basic health care. And in every school built meals were guaranteed. Over 95% of rural primary school children now receive free lunches sourced from local farmers. Then came a decision that stunned even his critics. Rather than continuing endless battles with extremist groups, many of which had grown from desperation and distrust, Traore extended an olive branch, not a rifle. His administration began negotiating local peace deals, offering amnesty and vocational training to militants willing to lay down arms. Over 12,000 former fighters accepted the offer. They were resettled, retrained, and in many cases hired as agricultural workers under the newly formed Farmers of Peace
program. Traore understood something that many leaders miss. You cannot bomb people into peace. You must offer them a future. But perhaps the most visionary project of all was the creation of the Sahel Life Alliance, a regional pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger aimed at ecological restoration across the semi-arid Sahel region. In just over a year, the alliance planted 800 million trees, combating desertification and building green jobs in regions long forgotten by modern industry. It was peace not negotiated in fancy hotels, but grown one seedling at a time. These achievements were not announced with pomp. There were no PR firms, no think tank consultants, just farmers, teachers, and community leaders working side by side. But the world took notice, quietly at first, then unmistakably. And so on that morning in Oslo, when Ibrahim Traore's name was read, it wasn't just a nomination, it was a statement, a challenge to how we define peace in the 21st century. A man who rose through the ranks not of politics but of the people, a leader who didn't build tanks but clinics, who didn't pose for photos but stood in mud with children and teachers and former fighters. For the people of Burkina Faso, this wasn't just their leader's moment, it was their own. The turning point didn't come with a gunshot or an election speech, it came from a place few expected: the Vatican. On July 1st, 2025, during the annual feast of All Saints Pope Leo XIII, a man known for his deep commitment to social justice and economic dignity, paused during his address and said, "The unthinkable. When I pray for peace, the face of a young soldier from Burkina Faso appears in my mind. He does not preach through scripture or law, but through sweat and soil." That single sentence broke centuries of silence. For the first time in modern papal history, the Vatican publicly endorsed a sitting African leader not just as a man of peace, but as a worthy candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. The news traveled fast. In Ouagadougou Church, bells rang in rural parishes, not to announce Mass, but to celebrate the words of a pope who had never set foot in Burkina Faso, but had seen its fields from afar. It was more than symbolism. It was canonization through labor. The Vatican's official nomination became the spark that lit a fire across diplomatic circles. Within 48 hours, global responses poured in. From Paris President Anne-Luc Moreau, a moderate technocrat often skeptical of post-colonial African populism, offered a rare nod. We may not agree with all of Mr. Traore's methods, but we cannot ignore the results. He is writing a new chapter in Africa's story with action, not aid. It was a reluctant admiration, the kind offered by a nation still wrestling with its colonial past. France had once ruled Burkina Faso with an iron hand. Now it watched that same nation dictate a new moral vocabulary to the world. In Washington, Secretary of State Janet R. Collins was more cautious. "We respect the nomination and acknowledge Mr. Traore's role in fostering regional stability. This is a moment to reflect on what peace means in our time." Diplomatic, polished, but beneath the surface, the discomfort was clear. Traore had rejected IMF loans. He expelled foreign mining firms. He banned GMO imports. He was not playing by the global rulebook. He was writing his own. And still his people were rising not in rebellion, but in self-reliance. In Brazil, however, the tone was different. President Luiz G. Costa, a former union organizer, didn't mince words. "I once called him the new Sankara. He corrected me and said, 'I'm just a farmer in uniform.' That's when I knew he deserved the Nobel." The South heard the signal. In Buenos Aires, Lima, and Johannesburg, editorials celebrated Traore not just as an African leader, but as a representative of a wider global South awakening. In Moscow, the Kremlin was direct. President Dmitry Alexeyev said, "He is not a strategist of ideology, but a builder of futures, of clinics, of forests, of belief." Each capital saw something different. To Europe, he was an anomaly. To America, a challenge. To the global South, a brother. To Russia and China, a shift in the wind. But to his own people, he was everything. By July 27th, the city of Ouagadougou was glowing. Homemade lanterns lit up the dusty night. Vendors sold roasted peanuts and besap. Elders sat on plastic chairs holding radios to their ears, and children held signs that read, "We no longer beg." Now, the world listens. The impact was not confined to Burkina Faso. In Bamako and Niamey, murals of Traore appeared overnight, painted by youth collectives who projected his speeches onto neighborhood walls. In Lagos, a student tweeted, "He didn't wear a suit. He wore boots. He didn't go to Davos. He went to the farms. That's why this Nobel matters." Universities across Africa organized panels, poetry readings, and vigils. In Kinshasa, students formed a human chain that spelled "On board Nobel for Africa," visible from drone footage. At the grassroots level, the peace wasn't just symbolic, it was working. Terror attacks had dropped 70% in the Sahel. School attendance was at an all-time high. More than 80% of rural clinics reported full staffing and supplies. And for the first time in decades, mothers slept without fear of night raids. Former fighters tilled maize fields, their uniforms now bearing the words "Farmers of Peace." In every corner of the Sahel, something old and sacred was returning trust. But not everyone rejoiced. Some Western analysts warned of precedents, fearing that Traore's recognition might embolden other military-led governments. In African Union circles, debate broke out over whether its rapid response mechanisms built to isolate coup leaders were now outdated. One commissioner speaking anonymously said, "We can no longer judge leaders by how they came to power, but by what they do once they have it." This was the new dilemma. Do we cling to ideals, or do we honor impact the world had to choose? At sunrise on July 28, 2025, a single banner stretched between two acacia trees outside Thomas Sankara Square read, "This is not a prize for a man. This is a moment for a continent." What began as a global nomination had now become a national affirmation. But beyond the headlines and applause, the real impact of Ibrahim Traore's leadership was visible not in press conferences, but in fields clinics and community halls across Burkina Faso. In the once abandoned northern province of Yatenga, a former conflict zone, schoolchildren now wore clean uniforms, walking barefoot, but proud to class under roofs made of local brick and community labor. Each school was named after either a fallen teacher or a peacemaker, a reminder that this education was not a gift, but a legacy built on sacrifice. At rural health centers, mothers carried infants wrapped in colorful pagnies, lined up quietly for vaccinations. The centers, many of them built in just under 3 months, were staffed by young nurses from the National Civic Corps, a program launched by Traore to replace elite bureaucracies with trained local volunteers. Posters on the wall read, "Peace is a healthy child. Dignity is a healed mother." In villages where militants once ruled with fear, former fighters now harvested corn and sweet potatoes under the banner of the Farmers of Peace. Their weapons surrendered, their scars visible. They now wore overalls labeled not with military ranks, but with names like Jean the Replanter or Sita the Teacher. Some had returned to the very villages they once attacked, now seeking forgiveness through work, not words. One such man, Adama Diallo, told a local journalist, "I was lost. He, Traore, gave me a chance to be useful. Not feared, just useful." But this transformation was not confined to the countryside. In the capital, Ouagadougou public squares, once filled with protests, now hosted night schools for working adults. The national radio shifted from broadcasting political sermons to airwaves filled with folk music, public service announcements, and agricultural tips. The Ministry of Peace and Reconciliation, once mocked as symbolic, now coordinated over 100 pardoned ex-militants, placing them in community farms, irrigation teams, and teacher training programs. What made it different was not just the scale, it was the tone. The entire apparatus of state governance had shifted from command to collaboration. Meanwhile, civil society, often sidelined in military regimes, experienced a quiet renaissance. Women's cooperatives expanded rapidly, especially in the Kulpelogo region, where over 300 female-led groups were granted access to microloans and farmland. In a country where women were often left out of land discussions, this was more than inclusion. It was a reversal of history. Political scientists were stunned. The metrics were clear. Infant mortality dropped by 18% in a year. Primary school enrollment rose from 67% to 84%. Food security stabilized across 11 out of 13 regions. But beyond numbers, the air itself seemed to change. In the words of journalist Marie Gonsaret, "You can feel it in the silence of a a night without gunfire. That silence is what peace sounds like. Neighboring countries began to take notice. On July 29th, just 2 days after the Nobel nomination, the presidents of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood shoulder to shoulder at a press conference in Ouagadougou. Their message was solemn and direct. This nomination is not a personal crown. It is proof that Africa can write its own story. They announced the launch of the Joint Civil Command of the Sahel, a civilian-focused alliance to coordinate efforts in food production, rural education, trauma counseling, and media literacy, effectively expanding the military alliance into a social development front. Even Guinea, Chad, and Togo, once cautious of Traore's rise, issued statements of congratulations, hinting at deeper regional realignment. The African Union, too, was forced to reckon with this shift. Until then, the AU's protocols were designed to isolate leaders who came to power via military means. But now the debate changed. In closed-door sessions, one senior AU official admitted, "We cannot continue to judge governments by the method of arrival. We must evaluate their commitment to public good." Burkina Faso's experience triggered working groups to reconsider AU's rapid response mechanism, with proposals to include impact-based legitimacy reviews, placing health, education, and social metrics above procedural orthodoxy. The conversation across Africa had changed. No longer was the central question, did he win power the right way? It had become, what did he do with the power once he had it? And for millions of Burkinabe, the answer was all around them. In the polished corridors of Washington, Brussels, and Geneva, the nomination of Ibrahim Traore posed a quiet dilemma. On paper, the world should celebrate a man who turned battlefields into classrooms and former militants into farmers. But beneath the surface, a deeper unease settled in. For decades, Africa had been seen and treated as a problem to be managed, a place for peacekeeping missions, conditional loans, and carefully packaged development assistance. Now, a 36-year-old soldier who rejected that entire framework was being considered for the world's highest peace honor. In Washington, while official statements from the State Department emphasized respect for the nomination, the tone was diplomatic, not warm. The White House press secretary was asked directly if Traore's rise through a military transition disqualified him from such honors. She replied, "We believe democracy and free elections are cornerstones of legitimacy. That said, we acknowledge progress where it occurs." Behind closed doors, however, the questions were more pointed. What happens if other African countries follow Traore's model? What if rejecting IMF loans and expelling foreign contractors becomes the new norm? What if peace can be built without our aid or our permission? In European capitals, particularly France, the reaction was one of conflicted admiration. President Alain-Luc Moreau walked a fine line, calling Traore a complex figure, but admitting that his results cannot be ignored. In the media, some outlets praised his achievements, while others warned of legitimizing authoritarian governance. But outside these centers of power, the narrative was shifting. In Latin America, leaders from Brazil, Bolivia, and Colombia openly praised Traore, calling him a model for post-colonial development. In India and Indonesia, editorials compared him to Gandhi, not in nonviolence, but in self-reliance. In South Africa, veteran journalist Nomsa Dlamini wrote, "The West fears Traore not because he is dangerous, but because he is effective and not dependent." Global financial institutions, including the World Bank, began to soften their tone, quietly reopening communication channels with Burkina Faso, a shift that would have been unthinkable just months prior. The Nobel nomination had changed the conversation. Africa was no longer asking for a seat at the table, it was building its own. As the world counts down to December 10th, 2025, the day the Nobel Peace Prize will be awarded in Oslo, one question quietly echoes across continents. What if the winner is not a man of diplomacy, but a man of dirt-stained boots? Whether Ibrahim Traore receives the prize or not, something irreversible has happened. A poor, landlocked nation that once struggled in silence has forced the world to listen. Not through war, not through headlines, but through action. Children now read under trees that were once cut down for firewood. Ex-fighters now irrigate maize instead of planting mines. And mothers once afraid of nightfall now hum songs as they cook school meals. This is not the kind of peace we're used to celebrating. It doesn't come with treaties or press releases. It comes with with calloused hands, forgiven hearts, and a willingness to start again from the ground up. But with recognition comes risk. World powers don't easily accept models they can't control. Institutions don't reward those who operate outside their system. And Traore, for all his humility, is not just building farms. He's building a mirror, a reflection of what leadership could look like if it served people instead of profit. And mirrors make empires nervous. As the cameras prepare to focus on Oslo, the real test may not be the prize, but what follows. Will the world embrace a new model of peace, or quietly try to erase it? Traore himself seems to know what's at stake. From the balcony of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, he recently told a silent crowd, "This nomination belongs to every mother who fed a child from her own field, to every youth who picked up a shovel instead of a rifle, to every teacher who taught under a tree." We are building peace not to impress the world, but to survive. And so we leave you with this. Is this the kind of leader Africa needs and the world fears? Can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traore, or should we support someone else to succeed him? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traore. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.
Starting a YouTube channel can be very challenging, especially if you don't want to show your face, don't know what kind of videos to create, or even how to get monetized super fast. My name is Franklin Emmanuel, and in the last few months, I've launched over 20 new YouTube channels, gotten millions of views, and earned about $13,000 from YouTube without even showing my face. I've also helped hundreds of newbies just like you get started with a monetized faceless YouTube channel. I'm hosting a live training where I'll show you step by step how you can turn a brand new YouTube channel into a cash machine that gets thousands of views in a very short time. Look anywhere in this video, you'd see a sign up button. Go ahead and tap it, and you can register for the live training happening in the next few minutes. Do it right away, because this will be the last time you would ever see this video.
If it served people instead of profit. And mirrors make empires nervous. As the cameras prepare to focus on Oslo, the real
Smart Balance Oil is rich in gamma-oryzanol, may contribute to the reduction of bad cholesterol.
A new model of peace, or quietly try to erase it. Before the sun rises over the red earth of the Sahel, a cool mist hangs low on the ground, and the silence is broken only by the distant rumble of trucks on dirt roads. Inside those trucks packed in burlap sacks lies something almost forgotten by the world, but remembered in the songs of elders. It is called Nama, a native potato that has quietly survived for nearly 900 years in the villages of Burkina Faso. No brand name, no corporate logo, just a root that once saved families during famine and now carries the weight of a nation's future. For decades, this crop was nearly erased by colonial agriculture, dismissed as backward, replaced by imported hybrids. Its name survived only in whispers and in planting songs older than most modern states. And yet, under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traore, this humble tuber has stepped out of the shadows. It is no longer just food. It is a symbol of sovereignty, dignity, and memory. In just a few short years, Nama has gone from legend to lifeline, from forgotten root to billion-dollar export. But more than money, it has revived something far more powerful, the idea that Africans can feed themselves without asking permission. And now the question facing Burkina Faso and the world is as bold as it is urgent. Can a single root grown in silence for centuries truly transform not just one country, but the very way Africa sees its future? Or will powerful forces try once again to bury it? If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, and that Africa's awakening deserves to be heard, stay with us until the end of this story. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traore's vision. And subscribe if you believe that the future of Africa and the truth behind it must never again be silenced. The rediscovery of Nama did not begin with government officials or multinational investors. It began with a quiet walk in the hills of Toma in 2021. Dr. Abu Bakarza, a local agroecologist, noticed a small, stunted potato-like plant growing stubbornly out of the poorest soil. Villagers called it the root of rain, a crop said to hold water deep within its body, feeding not only families, but also the land itself. To the outside world, it was nothing. To the people of the Sahel, it was memory itself. Curious, Dr. Bakarza collected samples and sent them for genetic testing. The results shocked across West Africa. This was no ordinary potato, it was nama, the legendary cultivar described in 12th century oral histories of the Funi people. A root once thought lost to time had survived centuries of neglect, clinging to the soil like the people who had protected it. In that moment, the myth became fact, and the rebirth of Burkina Faso's forgotten treasure began. The government under President Ibrahim Traore recognized the potential immediately. Unlike cash crops imposed during the colonial era, nama was truly indigenous, adapted perfectly to the harsh rhythms of the Sahel. Policies were drafted to protect its seeds, fund local cooperatives, and train farmers in new methods that honored both tradition and science. This was not just an agricultural program, it was a movement of reclamation. Farmers who had once struggled to survive on millet and sorghum were introduced to a fusion of indigenous practices and modern ecological techniques. Solar-powered drip irrigation delivered just enough water to each plant, making use of the sun rather than fighting against it. Neem-based organic pesticides kept away pests without contaminating the land. Traditional composting rituals passed down by grandmothers enriched the fields naturally. The blend of ancestral knowledge and innovation turned what was once a fragile experiment into a booming revolution. The results were staggering. Within only 3 years, yields of nama increased by over 400%. What had once been harvested in handfuls now filled entire convoys of trucks bound for markets across West Africa. By early 2025, Burkina Faso was producing 1.8 million metric tons of nama annually. Exports reached over 22 countries, fulfilling 34% of Africa's total potato demand. Revenues surged to $8.4 billion, overtaking traditional staples like cotton and coffee. For a landlocked nation often dismissed as poor and dependent, this was nothing short of historic. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The deeper victory was found in the lives of ordinary citizens. Take the story of Fatoumata, a 42-year-old mother of 4 in Yaba. For most of her life, she farmed millet, earning less than $300 a year. In drought seasons, her family survived on wild greens and occasional food aid. Now, thanks to a village nama processing hub, she earns triple her old income. Her eldest son attends university. Her youngest wears shoes for the first time, and at night she still sings the ancient planting songs. Only this time she sings them while labeling export boxes proudly marked "Made in Burkina Faso." In town after town, the story repeated itself. Cooperatives of widows who once depended on handouts now built their own clinics with nama profits. Children who once walked barefoot now carried school bags. Youth who once fled to cities in search of opportunity began to return home, finding work in fields, drying facilities, and transportation. What had been dismissed as a forgotten crop was suddenly rewriting the country's economic and social map. For President Traore, nama's rebirth was more than an economic milestone. It was proof that sovereignty could take root in the soil itself. By protecting nama as a community-owned resource, Burkina Faso showed the world that dignity could not be imported and memory could not be patented. As sacks of the potato rolled out of dusty villages toward distant capitals, they carried more than food. They carried a message the future of Africa would not be dictated from Paris, Washington, or Beijing, but grown from its own earth on its own terms. The question that remained was this: how long would such independence be tolerated by the outside world? Success had brought prosperity, but it had also attracted attention, and with attention came those who would try to claim what was never theirs. Success always draws eyes, and by mid-2025, the once forgotten root of Burkina Faso was no longer a secret. Nama was appearing in high-end supermarkets from Lagos to Paris, and the world's agribusiness giants began circling like vultures. The first to arrive were the suits from Monsanto. They came not through the dusty fields where farmers still sang planting songs, but through the polished lobbies of hotels in Ouagadougou, armed with glossy brochures and polished promises. Their offer seemed tempting: hybridize Nama, place it in their global seed catalog, and provide access to cutting-edge labs, irrigation systems, and Western markets. Bigger yields, faster growth, global reach. It all sounded like progress. But buried deep in their contracts lay the real cost: licensing fees, genetic patents, and a shift of control from the villages of Burkina Faso to boardrooms thousands of miles away. If accepted, Nama would no longer belong to the people who had kept it alive through famine and song. It would become another commodity, owned, branded, and priced by outsiders. Soon after, representatives from the World Bank arrived with their own pitch. They spoke of refrigerated refrigerated rail lines, mechanized processing plants, and loans in the hundreds of millions of dollars to modernize the industry. But these loans came with string structural reforms, foreign oversight committees, and export quotas that would leave Burkina Faso's sovereignty hanging by a thread.
Now, money point.
Money point, thank you.
They carried a message the future of Africa would not be dictated from Paris. At this critical moment, the spotlight shifted to President Ibrahim Traore. The easy choice would have been to accept these offers, secure international funding, impress investors, and appear on the world stage as a partner in development. But Traore chose differently. When it came time to speak, he didn't stand behind microphones in a Western-style press conference. He stood before farmer students and cooperative leaders at the gates of the Zenari Agro Complex, a new solar-powered processing plant owned entirely by Burkina Faso's cooperatives. Looking straight into the cameras, his words cut like a blade. These potatoes are not for dependency. They are for dignity. That declaration was more than a rejection of contracts. It was a thunderclap of independence. For the first time, Burkina Faso had told the most powerful corporations and institutions in the world, no. This seed will not be patented. This soil will not be mortgaged. The reaction was electric. In Ouahigouya, women danced in the streets carrying baskets of Nama overhead, chanting freedom songs. In Tugan, farmers painted slogans across warehouse walls, "Our roots, our rights." In Yaba, children wrote essays at school calling Nama the potato of freedom. What had begun as an agricultural revival was becoming a cultural uprising. Traore's government moved quickly to turn symbolism into policy. Law 2025-131 was passed, granting permanent tax exemptions to women-led cooperatives and youth-run startups working with native crops. It mandated that any export deal include direct profit sharing with the villages that cultivated the root. In essence, it rewrote the rules of agriculture, placing the people, not corporations, at the center of trade. The world took notice. International media rushed to cover what they called the potato revolution. Economists debated whether a heritage-based economy could truly compete with corporate agriculture. Lobbyists for biotech companies accused Burkina Faso of romanticizing the past. But for the people living it, the meaning was clear. Nama was not just a product, it was proof. Proof that a forgotten crop could become an engine of sovereignty. Proof that dignity could not be loaned, it had to be planted. The cultural impact deepened when in July 2025, the Festival of Nama was held publicly for the first time in generations. Once banned under colonial rule, the festival returned in a wave of drum songs and blessings. At its center stood Yakuba Tambora, an 83-year-old elder who still remembered the full planting song. That morning, his voice carried across the crowd, each line answered in unison by thousands. The root that fed the drought. The crop that never begged, the tuber that remembered our names when the world forgot. Tears flowed, drums pounded, and a people reclaimed not only a plant, but their own story. If the rediscovery of Nama had been the spark, this was the wildfire. A quiet root had become a banner of resistance, and Burkina Faso's defiance echoed across Africa. Yet, as celebrations filled the streets, one truth remained: saying no to the world's most powerful institutions comes at a cost, and those who once buried Nama would not give up so easily. The revolution of Nama was not only measured in tons exported or billions earned. Its most profound impact was etched into the daily lives of ordinary Burkinabés. Across villages and towns, the humble potato became the foundation of a new social contract, one that bound dignity to soil and sovereignty to community. For decades, families like Fatimata's in Yaba had lived at the edge of survival. Millet harvests brought meager returns, and drought years reduced entire provinces to hunger. Today, her story was no longer about survival, but transformation. With her income tripled by working at a cooperative processing hub, she no longer waited for food aid. Her eldest son studied at university. Her youngest child had shoes for the first time. Her evenings were no longer filled with despair, but with the rhythm of planting songs now sung while labeling export boxes marked "Made in Burkina Faso." This change repeated across the nation. In Saba, a cooperative of widows who had once relied on seasonal millet pulled their Nama profits to build a community health clinic. No NGO logos, no foreign dignitaries, just a hand-painted sign above the door, built from the root. The root.
In Wahwa, 7-year-old Mariam helped her family dehydrate thin slices of nama using a solar dryer purchased through a microloan. Her monthly income surpassed what her mother once earned in a year funding school uniforms and even a tablet where she studied climate science.
In Tugan, a mechanic's son named Adrisa launched a repair service for the growing fleet of cold chain trucks. Within a year, his backyard workshop had grown into a 12-man crew, all under 25, keeping the roots moving. But Nama's greatest power was not only economic, it was cultural. For the first time in generations, indigenous knowledge was recognized as science. Parliament passed Decree 2024-09 designating cultivators over age 70 as custodians of agricultural knowledge. The daily lives of ordinary Burkinabe. Across villages and towns, the humble potato became the foundation of a new social contract, one that bound dignity to soil and sovereignty to community. For decades, families like Fatamatas and Yala had lived at the edge of survival. Millet harvests brought meager returns, and drought years reduced entire provinces to hunger. Today, her story is no longer about survival, but transformation. With her income tripled by working in a cooperative processing hub, she no longer needed for feeding. Her eldest son studied at university. Her youngest child had shoes for the first time. Her evenings were no longer filled with despair, but with the rhythm of planting songs now sung while these elders received stipends to teach soil rituals, planting techniques, and harvest ceremonies in schools and cooperatives. What had once been dismissed as folklore became a legally protected form of applied science. The Ministry of Education even introduced a new subject, Land and Legacy, teaching children both the biology of drought-resistant crops and the history of how colonial policies had erased local food systems. This fusion of tradition and modernity shifted the political landscape. For decades, agricultural policy in Burkina Faso had been donor-driven, shaped by IMF loans and external reforms. Now, for the first time, the blueprint came from within. Lawmakers began drafting policies modeled after the Nama framework, protecting native crops from foreign patents, mandating cooperative ownership structures, and incentivizing eco-friendly practices rooted in ancestral knowledge. The cultural unity forged by Nama was equally striking. Burkina Faso is a mosaic of ethnic groups, Mosifula, Tuareg, Gumanche, often divided by politics or geography. Yet Nama belonged to all and none. Every community remembered it differently, but all recognized it as part of their shared heritage. By law, every Nama cooperative now included an elder advisor, a female director, and a youth apprentice, ensuring generational gender and cultural balance. This structure was not symbolic. It was strategic, making sure no group could claim ownership alone. Politically, President Ibrahim Traore's bold stance against Monsanto and the World Bank cemented his reputation not just as a head of state, but as a defender of sovereignty. While critics abroad accused him of isolating Burkina Faso at home, he was celebrated as the leader who had refused to sell memory. Approval ratings soared, and the phrase "potato of freedom" became a rallying cry across market, schools, and social media. Yet this defiance also carried risks. Reports surfaced of attempts to smuggle Nama seeds abroad for genetic replication. Parliament responded with Law 2026-14 establishing a National Genetic Heritage Registry to protect native species from foreign patents. The message was unambiguous. Burkina Faso's heritage was not for sale. By 2026, the humble tuber had reshaped not only the nation's economy, but also its identity. What began as an agricultural revival had matured into a social and political revolution, one where sovereignty was not negotiated in Geneva, but harvested in the red earth of the Sahel. And as the movement grew, it sparked a wider question across Africa. If Burkina Faso could rediscover its Nama, what treasures lay hidden in the soils of other nations? The rise of Nama was not just a Burkinabe story. It was a challenge to the very architecture of global agriculture, and the world was watching. In Washington, policy analysts described Burkina Faso's defiance as concerning warning that rejecting biotech partnerships could isolate the nation from Western markets. Corporate lobbyists in Brussels went further, accusing Ouagadougou of spreading anti-science sentiment that might embolden other African states to resist foreign agricultural aid. Behind the carefully worded statements lay a simple fear: if Burkina Faso could thrive on its own terms, what would stop the rest of Africa Africa from following international media picked up on the symbolism. Headlines in Paris asked whether Africa's potato revolution was sustainable or merely political theater. Business journals in London debated whether a heritage-based economy could withstand the pressure of global supply chains. Yet the more outsiders questioned it, the more the movement gained legitimacy across the continent. For many Africans, criticism from the West was itself a sign that Nama mattered. Even in the United States, reactions were divided. Some academic institutions praised Burkina Faso for blending indigenous knowledge with ecological science, calling it a model for climate-resilient agriculture. Others, particularly those tied to biotech industries, warned of lost opportunities for investment. On talk shows, commentators compared Traore's stand to earlier struggles over oil and gold, arguing that Africa was once again rejecting foreign control over its most valuable resource. Meanwhile, across the global south, the response was far more enthusiastic. In Brazil, Amazonian communities saw parallels between Nama and their own forgotten cassava strains. In Vietnam, agricultural researchers traveled to Ouagadougou to study how indigenous crops could be revived without surrendering to multinational patents. In Tunisia, desert farmers adapted Nama's water retention methods to improve date palm cultivation. Far from isolation, Burkina Faso had sparked a new conversation about memory-driven development, a framework where progress came not from imported models, but from recovering what had been buried by colonialism. The African Union could not ignore the momentum. By late 2025, its agricultural charter included explicit protections for indigenous crops modeled directly on Burkina Faso's Nama decrees. Ministers from Mali, Kenya, and Zimbabwe visited the Zenari agro-complex not to offer aid, but to learn. For once, Africa was not the subject of experiments in Geneva or Brussels, it was setting the agenda. This shift unsettled Washington and Brussels. Trade envoys quietly pressured Burkina Faso to reconsider its rejection of World Bank loans. Rumors spread of covert attempts to obtain Nama seeds for genetic replication abroad. Security analysts even raised alarms about the geopolitical risks of Africa asserting sovereignty through agriculture. For many Western strategists, the fear was clear: if a potato could fuel such independence, what would happen if oil, gold, or even technology were approached with the same philosophy? Yet for the people of Burkina Faso, these global debates mattered less than what they saw at home: full baskets, in-markets jobs for their children, and clinics built without foreign aid. Traore summarized it best at the Pan-African Food Sovereignty Forum in Accra: "We are not rejecting science. We are redefining it. Our laboratories begin in the field with the farmers who kept us alive when nothing else grew." His words resonated not just in Africa, but across the developing world, where communities long dismissed as subsistence, farmers began to see themselves as innovators and exporters. In Tunisia,
can a cooking oil reduce cholesterol? Yes, rice bran oil can. It is rich in gamma-oryzanol that reduces cholesterol. Alpha-1 in Asia and Golden Terra, Smart Balance oil in Africa help reduce cholesterol. Heart-healthy oil, the smart choice.
Since you pinned the first poster on your wall, you started creating a style all your own. Today, some things have changed, but your style has only become more uniquely you. At Signature Hardware, you'll find stylish statement pieces and cohesive collections that bring your look to life, from the faucets to the finishing touches, so you can create a space that's completely coordinated and completely you. Visit signaturehardware.com to shop or find a showroom today.
Trade envoys quietly pressured Burkina Faso to reconsider its rejection of World Bank loans. Rumors spread of covert attempts to obtain. By 2026, the world could no longer dismiss Nama as a curiosity. It had become a litmus test of sovereignty. For the West, it was a warning Africa would no longer accept dependency disguised as development. For Africa, it was an invitation to rediscover its own strengths and trade on its own terms. And for ordinary Americans watching from afar, it posed an uncomfortable but necessary question: if Burkina Faso could reclaim its forgotten crop to feed itself, what has America forgotten in its own soil? As the sun sets over the Sahel fields of Nama glow, gold against the horizon. Women carry woven baskets filled to the brim, children race ahead laughing, and elders walk slowly, their hands brushing the leaves like greeting old friends. It is a harvest scene, but it is also something more. It is a reminder that sovereignty can begin in the soil. For Burkina Faso, Nama is not simply food. It is proof. Proof that a nation once dependent on foreign aid can feed itself. Proof that the wisdom of ancestors once dismissed as superstition holds the keys to survival in an age of climate crisis. Proof that dignity does not need permission, but with proof comes danger. Reports already speak of attempts to smuggle Nama seeds across borders of corporate interests, plotting to patent what was never theirs. President Ibrahim Traore's warning echoes across the continent. If you take the seed, but forget the song, you will lose it again. The real threat is not hunger, but forgetting the knowledge, the culture, the memory that makes true independence possible. And so the story of Nama leaves us with a question that is larger than Burkina Faso. What have we forgotten in our own soil? What wisdom sleeps in our villages waiting to be revived? Because perhaps the future is not in what we invent, but in what we remember. If you believe that Africa's awakening deserves to be heard, please share this story so more people know that a humble potato has become a symbol of sovereignty. And if you believe that truth matters more than headlines, subscribe and join us, because the world is only beginning to witness what Africa and leaders like Ibrahim Traore can grow from their own ground. From afar, it posed an uncomfortable but necessary question. The morning sun had barely risen when the headline appeared, a single sentence that shook the silence of trading floors across the globe. Burkina Faso signs $14 billion grain deal with India. To many, it sounded impossible. A landlocked nation in West Africa, long overlooked by the world, except for its gold mines and political struggles, was now at the center of a story powerful enough to send markets trembling from New York to Mumbai. Grain prices spiked within minutes. Analysts rushed to television studios, traders spilled their coffee in disbelief, and rival exporters in South America and Eastern Europe felt the ground shift beneath their feet. But the most striking reaction was not from the markets, it was from ordinary Africans who for decades had been told that their nations could never rise beyond dependency. Suddenly, Burkina Faso was writing a new narrative, and the opening words were bold. Today, we are not just selling grain, we are shaping the future of Burkina Faso. This was not a simple transaction. This was a declaration of sovereignty, a message to the world that Africa could feed not just itself, but billions beyond its shores. Yet the questions remain. Why would India, already one of the largest food producers in the world, look to Burkina Faso? How did a country with no access to the sea manage to strike one of the largest agricultural deals of the decade? And what does this mean for Africa, for the United States, and for an unstable global food system shaken by climate change and conflict? Brothers and sisters, stay with me until the end of this story, because what began as a grain contract may well be remembered as the dawn of a new economic revolution. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traore. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. It was still early morning in Asia when the news broke. The world's financial centers were only just waking up. New York traders sipping their first cups of coffee, London's brokers glancing at the day's opening charts when a headline flashed across global screens and shifted the rhythm of markets everywhere. Burkina Faso signs a $14 billion grain export agreement with India. The numbers were stark and undeniable. 20 million metric tons of maize and sorghum, $14 billion in value, 10 years of guaranteed supply. No slogans, no lengthy speeches, just 3 paragraphs in the official release. And yet those simple lines carried the weight of a geopolitical earthquake. Within minutes of the announcement, commodity markets jolted awake. In Mumbai, futures contracts for maize and sorghum surged. In Chicago, the world's grain hub, nervous traders scrambled to reassess their positions. London's financial analysts cut short their morning routines and rushed to trading desks. Grain prices rose sharply, fueled not by speculation, but by the raw realization that the global food map had just changed. Television studios lit up. Agricultural economists were ushered into live broadcasts. Words like historic shift and game changer filled the airwaves. The shock was not only that India, a grain giant in its own right, was suddenly turning to imports, but that Burkina Faso, a landlocked, politically turbulent nation, was stepping into the spotlight as a global supplier. For decades, Burkina Faso was known primarily for its gold exports, its cotton fields, and its struggles with poverty and instability. Few outside Africa considered it an agricultural powerhouse. Yet here it was claiming a share of the massive Asian market and positioning itself alongside exporters from South America and Eastern Europe. The announcement rebranded the country overnight.
no longer merely a nation in the Sahel, Burkina Faso, was presented as an emerging breadbasket, a country capable of feeding millions beyond its borders. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, this deal was not just about money, it was about recognition, dignity, and a place at the global table. Why would India, which already produces hundreds of millions of tons of grain each year, strike such a deal? The answer lay in security and foresight. India's food system depends heavily on the monsoon. When rains are good, warehouses overflow. When rains fail, prices spike and shortages erupt. By securing long-term imports from Burkina Faso, India was creating a climate insurance policy. West Africa's rainfall patterns differ from South Asia's, meaning that a drought in India does not necessarily coincide with poor harvests in Burkina Faso. In effect, New Delhi was diversifying its food supply, shielding its population from the unpredictability of climate change. The ripple effects of the deal were immediate and international. In Argentina and Brazil, exporters who had dominated Asian grain markets for decades saw a new competitor rising. In Ukraine and Eastern Europe, countries already reeling from war and disrupted trade routes felt threatened by this unexpected rival. For these established players, Burkina Faso's entry was not just symbolic, it represented a real challenge to their market share. Industry analysts warned of a coming price war, as traditional exporters might lower prices or sweeten terms to protect their foothold in Asia. Despite the noise in markets, the official announcement itself was almost understated. No grand ceremonies, no sweeping rhetoric, just data tons, dollars, years. Yet sometimes it is precisely that simplicity that speaks the loudest. The absence of fanfare only heightened the sense of seriousness. This was more than a business contract. It was a strategy, a calculated partnership forged in trust and necessity. For India, it was about securing food and political influence in Africa. For Burkina Faso, it was about rewriting its identity and proving that even a landlocked country could shape global trade. And so, the world witnessed something extraordinary. In the dry heart of the Sahel, fields of maize and sorghum were suddenly not just crops, they were instruments of sovereignty. The ink on the $14 billion deal symbolized more than exports. It signaled to Africa and to the world that Burkina Faso was no longer content to remain on the margins. Today, we are not just selling grain, we are shaping the future of Burkina Faso. With those words echoed in every headline, the small West African nation announced its arrival on the global stage. The first wave was shock. The second was reaction. Within hours of the Burkina Faso-India grain deal announcement, the ripple had become a storm. Financial news networks went into overdrive. In Mumbai, anchors interrupted their scheduled segments with live updates. This is a turning point, one agricultural economist declared, as cameras zoomed in on flashing tickers showing maize and sorghum futures climbing higher and higher. In Chicago, traders stood shoulder to shoulder on the exchange floor, their voices rising above the noise as phones buzzed with urgent calls. London's brokers scrambled their morning calm, replaced by a flurry of panicked recalculations. Commodity charts lit up in red and green, signaling volatility. For years, analysts had assumed that only Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, or the United States could jolt global grain markets. Yet here it was, Burkina Faso, a country landlocked in West Africa, sending shockwaves across oceans. The louder responses came from rival exporters. In Buenos Aires, agricultural lobbies demanded emergency meetings with government officials. If India shifts even a fraction of its demand, Argentina's market share will shrink overnight, one grain union leader warned. In Sao Paulo, Brazilian soybean and maize exporters fretted. They had spent decades cultivating Asia as their primary customer base. Now, a competitor had appeared where none had been expected. In Kiev, still battered by war and struggling to keep exports flowing, the deal landed like a hammer blow. Ukrainian grain had long supplied Indian buyers. This threatens our recovery, a Ukrainian trade analyst admitted on live television. The anxiety wasn't limited to exporters. Middle Eastern importers observed carefully, wondering whether Burkina Faso might also supply their growing populations in the future. In Europe, some policy voices framed the agreement as evidence of a shifting world order where Africa no longer waited for permission, but forged direct partnerships. Closer to Ouagadougou, the emotions were different.
Across Burkina Faso, radio stations buzzed with discussions. Farmers in the Central Plains gathered around battery-powered radios, hearing their nation's name mentioned alongside India, Brazil, and Ukraine. "We never thought our sorghum could matter to the world," one farmer told a reporter. In neighboring Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Mali, governments took note. If Burkina Faso could overcome its landlocked geography and enter global markets, why couldn't they? Editorials in West African newspapers began asking pointed questions. If Ouagadougou can build railways to ports, what excuse do we have? The deal ignited ambition across the region. The true climax of the story was not just numbers on paper. It was the moment the world recognized Burkina Faso as a serious competitor in food security. Global commentators labeled the deal the Sahel shock. Analysts compared it to the moment when Middle Eastern oil first flooded Western markets decades ago. For the first time in modern history, the global food system had to account for a landlocked African nation. Burkina Faso's grain was no longer just for local markets or regional trade, it had become a factor in global calculations. This was the emotional high point, the transformation of perception. From overlooked to indispensable, from margins to center stage. Yet the narrative was contested. Optimists called it a masterstroke, a partnership of equals that could stabilize global food supply. Skeptics dismissed it as fragile. How could a country without direct access to the sea truly deliver 20 million tons over a decade? Would corruption pour harvests or political upheaval break the promise? International outlets highlighted both voices, creating an atmosphere of suspense. Could Burkina Faso deliver, or would it stumble under the weight of expectations? Though Washington did not release a formal statement, American analysts privately admitted concern. The Chicago Grain Exchange, long considered a bellwether of world agriculture, was now reacting to African news in ways it hadn't before. For U.S. farmers, the question loomed: if India bought from Burkina Faso, would demand for American grain soften? The geopolitical undertone was unmistakable. Every trade deal carries politics, and this one whispered of a future where Africa was no longer a passive participant, but a strategic actor capable of shifting global balances. Above all, the reaction revealed emotion. Pride in Africa, alarm in South America, curiosity in the Middle East, suspicion in Europe, concern in America. What bound them together was one undeniable fact: Burkina Faso could no longer be ignored. The announcement was no longer just a headline. It was a climax, a story unfolding with drama, uncertainty, and the promise of transformation. The world was watching. The ink on the $14 billion agreement was barely dry when the deeper questions began to surface. If Burkina Faso was to become a global grain supplier, what would that mean for its own citizens, its politics, and its place in the African continent? The transformation of perception, from overlooked to indispensable, from margins to center stage. Yet the narrative was contested.
Why lift your hands when the world feels heavy?
A partnership of equals that could stabilize.
Why sing when life feels silent?
How could a country without direct
Why pour your heart into a song the world may never understand? Why worship through the tears, through the night, through the fire? Why unite across cultures, across generations, across nations? Because he is worthy, because he reigns, because his name unites us all.
For U.S. farmers, the question loomed: if India bought from Burkina Faso, would demand for American grain soften? The geopolitical undertone was
Customer, not transfer, Abby.
And this one whispered of
for
a
your
future where Africa
progress.
was no longer a passive participant. For ordinary Burkinabe, the first concern was simple: will there still be enough to eat for us? It was a valid fear. A country that exports millions of tons could risk shortages at home if profits outweighed people's needs. The government anticipated this anxiety. The deal included strict safeguards, a fixed percentage of national grain production reserved for domestic consumption, untouchable even if world prices skyrocketed, a share of revenue dedicated to subsidizing local food prices and funding irrigation projects, ensuring long-term productivity. By embedding these protections, Ouagadougou sent a message: the deal was not a betrayal of its people, but a plan to grow both exports and local supply simultaneously. Still, the true test would come in practice, whether promises translated into grain on tables in villages from Bobo Dioulasso to Kaya. For farmers, the implications were profound. India pledged not only to buy grain, but also to invest in Burkina Faso's agricultural infrastructure. This meant modern storage silos to reduce post-harvest losses, irrigation systems to make farming less dependent on rainfall, training programs introducing new techniques and technologies. The impact stretched beyond economics. In the Central Plains, young farmers who once dreamed of leaving for Europe now began to see agriculture as a path to dignity and income. The countryside, long seen as a place of poverty, was being reframed as the engine of national pride. The logistics challenge Burkina Faso's landlocked geography had always been seen as a curse. Suddenly, it became a catalyst for investment. Together, India and Burkina Faso agreed to co-fund upgraded rail lines connecting Ouagadougou to coastal ports in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, expanded road networks linking rural farms to export hubs, increased storage capacity in regional ports. These projects went far beyond grain. They promised new jobs, faster trade for other sectors, and stronger ties with neighboring countries. Infrastructure in this sense was not just engineering, it was diplomacy binding West Africa together in shared opportunity. Domestically, the government reaped political dividends. For decades, Burkina Faso's leaders had been portrayed as fragile, dependent on foreign aid, or overshadowed by instability. Now, under the banner of this deal, the state projected an image of strength and vision. By choosing India, a partner offering investment without heavy political conditions, Burkina Faso asserted its sovereignty. Unlike Western powers who often tied trade to military or governance reforms, New Delhi framed the relationship as equals at the table. For a nation historically constrained by colonial legacies, this was a symbolic victory. The civil and political consequences were not limited within national borders. Across West Africa, leaders faced mounting pressure from their own citizens. If Burkina Faso can negotiate fair terms, why can't we? The agreement lit a fire of expectation. It challenged African governments to prioritize food exports, infrastructure, and independence from Western tutelage. In this way, Burkina Faso's decision carried a political charge that extended across the Sahel and beyond. Yet, alongside optimism, risks loomed. Climate shocks could derail production. Corruption or mismanagement could siphon off revenues. Political opposition might exploit domestic food price fluctuations to weaken the government. International rivals might seek to destabilize such a bold experiment. The civil political consequences were therefore double-edged. The deal offered dignity and development, but also exposed Burkina Faso to greater scrutiny and vulnerability. For now, pride outweighed fear. Citizens saw themselves no longer as victims of poverty, but as contributors to global security. In dusty towns and fertile valleys, the message echoed. Burkina Faso was no longer only the land of cotton and gold, it was now a grain nation with political weight. The true consequence of the deal was not just measured in dollars or tons of maize, but in the transformation of identity. A people who had long been told they were weak now saw themselves as actors in history. The $14 billion grain deal did not just alter trade flows. It forced the world's major powers to rethink their assumptions about Africa, food security, and sovereignty. In Washington, the reaction was cautious. Official statements were muted, but the unease was clear in financial circles. For decades, the United States has prided itself on being a dominant grain supplier, with Chicago as the beating heart of global commodity trade. Now, the Chicago Board of Trade was reacting not to U.S. weather reports or South American harvests, but to headlines from Ouagadougou. American analysts voiced two concerns: market influence. If India turned increasingly to Burkina Faso, U.S. grain exports could face declining demand in Asia, undercutting America's leverage. Geopolitical significance. The deal symbolized a growing trend of African nations choosing non-Western partners, bypassing Washington's influence. Though no public confrontation emerged, the whispers in think tanks carried weight. Was the U.S. witnessing the erosion of its agricultural and political dominance? In Brussels, the European Union struggled with ambivalence. On one hand, officials applauded any move that diversified global food supply and reduced reliance on volatile exporters like Ukraine. On the other, they worried that Africa's new assertiveness might weaken Europe's long-standing influence on the continent. For decades, European aid programs had been tied to agricultural development in Africa, often under paternalistic frameworks. Burkina Faso's success in negotiating a deal of equals with India directly challenged that model. Some European commentators admitted reluctantly that the age of dependency politics was waning. China already deeply invested in African infrastructure and agriculture watched with a mix of curiosity and competition. Beijing had long championed South-South cooperation, but New Delhi's move signaled that India too was ready to claim leadership in Africa. Analysts in Beijing framed the deal as the start of a quiet rivalry between Asia's two giants for African partnerships. In the Middle East, import-dependent nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE viewed Burkina Faso's breakthrough with interest. If the Sahel could supply India, why not the Gulf? Editorials in regional media speculated that West Africa might soon become the next frontier of food security contracts. Beyond individual powers, the world saw the Burkina Faso-India deal as a marker of multipolarity.
With the all-new Tasty Tom 2-in-1 seasoning powder, busting with 8 grams of premium seasoning cubes, plus 3 grams of vibrant spices. This gives you 11 grams of 2-in-1 magic. No extra seasoning needed. Tasty Tom, bust of flavors.
Non-Western partners bypassing Washington's influence.
Start with a 50% deposit bonus. Increase your investing power with Pocket Broker. 100 plus investing assets, instant top-up and withdrawal with no fees.
In Brussels, the European Union struggled with ambivalence. On one hand, officials applauded any move that diversified global food supply and reduced reliance on volatile exporters like Ukraine. On the other, for decades, food trade was concentrated in the hands of a few exporters, the US, Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine. Smaller nations were rarely part of the equation. This agreement broke that mold. It sent a symbolic message in an age of climate change and geopolitical tension. Even landlocked nations could rise as strategic players. That symbolism resonated across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Anywhere countries were looking to reduce dependency on traditional Western suppliers. Global experts distilled 3 key lessons from the deal. Diversification is survival. Nations can no longer rely on a single region for food imports. Infrastructure equals independence. Without railways, ports, and silos, no country, no matter how fertile, can compete globally. Respect matters. Partnerships built without political strings endure longer and inspire more trust than those framed as dependency. Perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. For the first time, policymakers in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Riyadh had to treat Burkina Faso as more than a peripheral state. Its fields of maize and sorghum were now entangled with their economies, their food systems, and their political strategies. The deal was more than an African success. It was a reminder to the world sovereignty, when defended with vision and trust, can transform even the smallest nations into global actors. From a single headline at dawn to waves of debate across continents, the $14 billion grain deal between Burkina Faso and India has already proven itself to be more than trade. It is a statement, a declaration that even nations once dismissed as marginal can redraw the lines of global power. But with opportunity comes risk. Can Burkina Faso deliver 20 million tons without compromising the food security of its own people? Will infrastructure investments arrive on time, or will delays weaken trust? And in a world where climate shocks, political instability, and market volatility are constant threats, can this bold promise truly endure a decade? This agreement broke that mold. These questions are not just for Ouagadougou or New Delhi. They are for all of us. Because if a landlocked African country can suddenly shape global food prices, then the balance of power is shifting before our eyes. This is not just Burkina Faso's experiment. It is a test for the future of multipolar trade, for Africa's sovereignty, and for how the world adapts to new realities. Brothers and sisters, history has given us a rare moment. The maize and sorghum fields of Burkina Faso are now woven into the destiny of billions. What happens next will either inspire a generation or serve as a warning of what could have been. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traore's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or is this only the beginning of a greater gamble? And please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traore. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines.
It was a dry season morning in 2025, and the ground across Burkina Faso was split open like clay left too long in the sun. For years, families in the Sahel had waited for miracles that never came. Foreign food trucks that arrived late, sacks of grain stamped with other nations' flags, speeches that promised more than they delivered. Hunger had become routine and trust had been buried deep in the cracked earth. But then came the rumble, not from the sky, but from the road. Dust rose on the horizon as a long convoy of military trucks rolled across the countryside. Villagers braced themselves. For decades, the sight of those vehicles meant orders fear, or the taking of sons into wars they never chose. But this time, the soldiers carried something else. Not weapons, not commands. Instead, each truck was filled to the brim with sacks of maize seed, 5,000 metric tons in all. One by one, the soldiers stepped down. They walked not to enforce, but to deliver. In every village, they knocked on doors, called families out from their courtyards, and placed heavy bags of seed directly into their hands. Mothers clutched them to their chests like treasure. Fathers ran calloused fingers over the kernels as if touching the future itself. Children giggled as they dug their hands into the grain, the dry seeds slipping between their fingers like tiny golden coins. What happened that morning was more than distribution. It was recognition. For the first time in years, every farmer, every household, every elder saw the government not as a distant power, but as a neighbor who came to their door and said, "This land is still yours. These seeds are your hope. Plant them, and Burkina Faso will rise again." The reaction was immediate and deeply human. In one village, drums began to beat as families gathered in circles celebrating the delivery as if it were a festival. In another, elders bowed their heads in tears, whispering prayers of thanks, not for charity, but for dignity returned. Across the dry valleys of the Sahel, word spread faster than the trucks could travel. The army came today, but they came with seeds. It was a transformation in symbolism as powerful as it was practical. The same vehicles that once carried fear now carried the promise of food and survival. The same soldiers once seen as enforcers now became bearers of life. And as the convoy pushed deeper into the countryside, a single question began to echo among the people. Was this the beginning of a miracle, or just a gamble, dressed in the uniform of hope? The decision had been made in the capital of Ouagadougou, inside a government war room that until recently was used to plan military campaigns. In that stark chamber, President Ibrahim Traore stood before his commanders and issued an order that some thought unthinkable. The trucks will not carry guns. They will carry maize. Every household, every farmer must be given seed. At first, even his closest advisors hesitated. Generals who had spent their lives organizing supply lines for combat now found themselves tasked with organizing a logistics chain for agriculture. Skeptics whispered, "This is not how governments act. You don't fight hunger with convoys. You fight it with imports, with aid, with negotiation." But Traore was unmoved. He knew that speeches would not fill stomachs. What the nation needed was direct action, visible, undeniable, personal. And so the plan took shape. Military trucks normally reserved for transporting troops were repurposed overnight. Warehouses that once stored ammunition were stacked high with burlap sacks of maize seed. In total, 5,000 metric tons, an unprecedented quantity, enough to touch every corner of Burkina Faso. Soldiers were briefed not as enforcers, but as couriers of hope. Their mission was clear: deliver, not command. The convoy began its journey at dawn. Long lines of green military vehicles rolled out of the capital, their engines echoing across the Sahel plains. Villages that had long felt abandoned by their government suddenly found themselves at the center of attention. In the north, in towns bordering Mali and Niger, families rushed out to the roadsides, waving as the trucks approached. In the south, farmers paused in their fields, watching as the dust clouds grew larger, wondering if this time the promise was real. When the trucks stopped, the ritual began. Soldiers jumped down, not with rifles, but with ledger books and distribution lists. One by one, they called out names. Families stepped forward and were handed sacks of maize seed, enough to plant and sustain them through the coming season. Every interaction carried weight: a handshake, a salute, a few words of encouragement. For many villagers, it was the first time in living memory that a soldier had spoken to them not as a subordinate, not as a suspect, but as a partner in survival. The symbolism ran deep. These were not faceless aid drops parachuted from foreign planes. This was not food stamped with logos of distant nations. It was Burkina Faso's own seed, its own trucks, its own soldiers delivering directly to its own people. Ownership mattered. For too long, farmers had been made to feel like passive recipients of charity. On this day, they became participants in a national rebirth, and the effect was immediate. In every village, visited scenes of emotion unfolded. Mothers tore open the sacks to run their fingers through the kernels, laughing through tears. Fathers placed small handfuls of seed into the palms of their children, telling them, "This is our future. Guard it well." Children sang improvised songs about soldiers and seeds. In some places, local musicians began composing ballads that would be played on radios for months to come. The convoy did not just distribute maize, it delivered a message that the government was present, watching, and willing to act boldly without waiting for approval from international agencies. A young farmer in Yatenga province said it best during a local radio interview. "For years, we stood in line waiting for foreign food. Today, my country came to me at my own home with seeds for my own land. This is the first time I believe we are not forgotten." By the end of the first week, thousands of households had been reached. Fields once abandoned were being tilled again, anticipation growing as kernels were pressed into the soil. The trucks kept moving, crossing rivers, climbing rocky passes, pushing through villages where aid agencies had long since given up. And everywhere they went, they left behind more than sacks of maize. They left behind dignity. It was not lost on anyone that this was also a gamble. 5,000 tons of seed was a monumental commitment. If the rains failed, if the soil resisted, if pests came, the loss would be staggering. But for a population that had already endured decades of disappointment, the gamble itself was a kind of victory. As one elder put it, "Even if only half the seeds grow, it will still feed more than any promise ever has." That was the spirit that defined the first stage of the campaign. Bold, risky, defiant. A government refusing to let its people wait one more season for outside salvation. Trucks delivering not just maize, but proof that Burkina Faso was willing to write its own destiny. For weeks after the convoys rolled through the countryside, the land remained silent. The sacks of maize seed were stacked in courtyards, tucked away in storage huts, and portioned into small baskets. Families waited for the skies. They had been disappointed too many times before by false rains and broken promises, but then, almost as if nature itself had answered, the gamble clouds began to gather. The first drops came softly tapping on corrugated tin roofs and mud walls. Farmers rushed into their fields carrying baskets of seed. Women knelt at the edges of plots, pressing kernels into soil that had been dead for years. Children followed their laughter, mingling with the sound of falling rain. Entire villages erupted in activity. Where once there had been resignation, there was now urgency. An urgency to plant, to believe, to hope. Within days, the cracked earth began to shift. Tiny shoots of green pierced through the dust, fragile but defiant. Farmers who had all but given up returned to their fields daily, bending low to examine the sprouts as if they were newborn children. Word spread quickly across radio stations. The maize is rising. Satellite images soon confirmed what eyes on the ground already knew. Strange lines of emerald began to snake across the Sahel, painting the barren landscape with life. The emotional impact was immense. In villages, drums echoed late into the night as celebrations broke out. Elders called the rains and the maize a double blessing. Priests and imams led prayers of gratitude, declaring the season sacred. In some communities, people marked their foreheads with maize kernels during ceremonies symbolizing rebirth. The army once feared was now sung about in praise songs broadcast over community radio. Children painted pictures of trucks loaded not with soldiers but with life. And then came the food itself. As the plants matured, families who had grown used to stretching thin bowls of millet gruel now roasted fresh maize over open fires. Women ground maize into flour for porridge cakes and bread. Livestock fed on stalks, strengthening animals that had been wasting away. Health clinics reported an immediate drop in cases of malnutrition and anemia. For the first time in years, many children went to bed full. The ripple effects went beyond food. Markets began to revive. Families who once sold labor cheaply just to survive now brought baskets of maize to trade. Songs about the trucks of maize became local anthems. One popular refrain echoed across radio waves. They brought us not weapons, but seeds. For a people long accustomed to viewing government as distant and indifferent, the act of soldiers knocking on their doors to hand them hope became a turning point in perception. But the moment was not free of doubt. Agricultural experts voiced concerns on national broadcasts. What if next year the rains don't return? What if pests spread? What if distributing seed by truck proved unsustainable without irrigation systems and planning? Even supporters admitted the risks. Yet among ordinary farmers, the response was consistent. Let tomorrow worry for itself. Today, our children are fed. One farmer in the Central Plateau summarized the mood on a community radio show. For decades, we were told salvation comes from aid trucks flying other flags. This year, it came from our own soil with seeds given to us by our own people. Even if the harvest fails in the future, this moment cannot be erased. We have seen what is possible. The climax of that season arrived with the first harvest. Fields that had once been dust bowls shimmered golden with maize stalks. Families gathered together to harvest by hand, filling baskets, laughing, singing. Across the Sahel, the sight of trucks once again rumbling into villages returned, but this time not to deliver seed. This time, they were loaded with grain harvested by the people themselves, grain destined not only for local markets, but for trade across borders. What began as a desperate gamble had turned into a visible living miracle. The land had answered, the people had risen, and the government had delivered on its promise. For once, hope did not arrive in the form of foreign slogans or handouts. It sprouted directly from the soil watered by rain and belief. And in that transformation, Burkina Faso began to write a new story, one in which survival was no longer borrowed, but owned. The harvest of 2025 did more than fill stomachs. It set off a chain reaction across Burkina Faso that reached far beyond the fields. What began with the delivery of seeds by military trucks soon reshaped the country's economy, its politics, and its sense of self. In the villages, new forms of organization began to emerge. Women, long the backbone of subsistence farming, quickly recognized the opportunity. Groups of 20 or 30 pooled their maize harvests together, grinding kernels into flour, pressing them into oil, and baking them into goods for sale in nearby markets. In one northern province, women branded their cooking oil with the name Sahel's Gold, selling it not only in local stalls, but across regional borders. Profits that once flowed to middlemen now stayed in the hands of families. With earnings, they built wells, funded schools, and hired teachers. By 2028, government data revealed a striking fact. Over 70% of newly formed maize cooperatives were led by women. And with leadership came influence. Women began speaking in village councils, negotiating fairer prices, and even lobbying local officials for better storage facilities. In places where they had once been voiceless, they now became central actors in shaping the rural economy. The youth followed suit. For decades, migration had been the dream of many young men crossing deserts and seas to search for work in Europe. But after the maize convoys, many began to see opportunity at home. In the town of Kaya, a group of young men invested their pooled harvest profits into a small milling machine. Within 2 years, they were packaging branded maize flour that sold across the Sahel. One of them, Issa, who once planned to leave for Italy, declared in a radio interview, "I used to dream of Europe. Now I dream of building a factory here." The government noticed. Ministries that had long been viewed as irrelevant suddenly found themselves forced to respond to the energy of the countryside. The Ministry of Agriculture launched training programs on crop diversification, while Parliament introduced price floor protections to prevent exploitation by traders. For the first time in decades, rural citizens felt that policies were being written with them in mind. Politically, the effect was transformative. President Traore, once seen primarily as a revolutionary soldier, gained legitimacy as a leader who delivered not just slogans but tangible change. Opposition parties struggled to counter his popularity. How can you argue with a full stomach, one analyst asked? Even critics admitted that his gamble with maize had altered the balance of trust between state and citizen. The military, too, underwent a transformation in public perception. Soldiers who had once been feared as instruments of coercion were now remembered as the men and women who had knocked on doors to deliver seeds. Trust once broken by years of coups and instability was slowly rebuilt. In schoolyards, children began drawing pictures of trucks loaded with maize, not guns. In popular songs, the army was praised as the hand that plants. Economically, the impact reverberated beyond the borders. Surpluses from the harvests opened new possibilities. Burkina Faso, once written off as a chronic importer of grain, began signing export contracts with neighbors and even with buyers as far as the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, hungry for reliable food sources, signed multi-year deals. India and China expressed interest in maize not only as food, but as feedstock for biofuels. Suddenly, what had begun as a survival strategy was evolving into an engine for trade. Yet with these gains came new challenges. European grain lobbies began sounding alarms. Reports circulated in Brussels warning that uncertified Burkinabe maize could distort regional markets. Trade officials called for stricter import regulations. But to many in Africa, it was clear the real fear was not quality control, but competition. For decades, West African markets had been flooded with subsidized European grain. Now, for the first time, an African nation threatened to flip the script. Inside Burkina Faso, however, such external concerns mattered little to those who had lived through the famine years. In their eyes, the true revolution was not in trade statistics, but in dignity restored. A farmer in the southern province of Banfora said it plainly: "They gave us seeds, and now we feed ourselves. That is freedom. That is independence." By the end of the decade, Burkina Faso's identity was no longer tied solely to poverty and dependency. It was tied to harvests, to cooperatives, to the pride of seeing children healthy and fields alive. The gamble of 2025 had become a foundation upon which an entire nation was rebuilding itself, not without risk, but with a confidence no foreign agency could have manufactured. As the maize harvest spread across Burkina Faso, the world began to take notice. For decades, the country had appeared in international headlines only as a site of famine instability or terrorism. Now it was appearing for something else entirely, a self-led agricultural revival born not from foreign aid, but from its own soil and its own decisions. In Europe, the reaction was swift and cautious. Trade desks in Brussels issued internal memos questioning whether Burkinabe maize met certification standards. Officials spoke in technical language about sanitary risks and market distortions. But to many observers, the subtext was clear. Europe's heavily subsidized grain exports to West Africa were suddenly facing competition. If Burkina Faso's model spread to neighboring states, it could shake the balance of trade that had long favored European producers. American policymakers, too, were divided. In Washington, some foreign aid officials quietly praised the experiment, noting the empowerment of women and youth through cooperatives. But agricultural lobbies saw danger. If African nations began producing their own grain at scale U.S., exports to the continent could shrink. Hearings in Congress raised questions. What does sovereignty mean when aid is no longer the lifeline, but trade is yet outside the halls of power? The American public, especially older generations, saw something different. In farm states across the Midwest, radio shows and newspapers told the story of Burkina Faso's trucks delivering seed door to door. For many listeners, it resonated with memories of their own families' struggles during the Dust Bowl or Great Depression. They understood the dignity that comes from planting, harvesting, and feeding one's children with food grown at home. Commentators drew sharp contrasts. If soldiers can hand out seeds instead of rifles, what's stopping us from rethinking what power really means, wrote one columnist in a national paper. Churches and community groups began to share the story in sermons and town meetings. To them, Ibrahim Traore's decision was not just an African story, it was a human story, a reminder that leadership could mean giving people the tools to feed themselves, rather than keeping them dependent. Elsewhere in the world, the ripple effects deepened. Saudi Arabia and the UAE signed long-term import deals. India and China expressed interest in both maize grain and byproducts like ethanol. For the first time, Burkina Faso was not only feeding itself, but also entering the global food chain on its own terms. This shift unsettled old assumptions. Aid agencies asked whether their traditional role was being undermined. Analysts in think tanks warned of geopolitical drift if African states turned more toward Asia and the Gulf for partnerships. But inside Burkina Faso, the debates abroad felt distant. What mattered was simple families were eating, farmers were selling, and dignity had returned. From Washington to Brussels, the maize revolution of Burkina Faso became more than an agricultural story. It was a challenge to the old order, a reminder that power does not always come from bombs or treaties, but sometimes from something as small and as enduring as a single seed placed in the hands of a farmer. The story of Burkina Faso's maize revolution did not end with the trucks, or even with the first harvest. In many ways, it was only the beginning. What started as 5,000 tons of seed handed out to households became a symbol of something far greater, the possibility that nations long dismissed as dependent could chart their own path to survival and dignity. But with every new beginning comes uncertainty. Even as green fields stretched across the Sahel, warnings lingered like shadows. Climate scientists predicted harsher droughts in the years to come. Economists cautioned that reliance on a single crop could bring new vulnerabilities. And critics abroad continued to raise barriers, fearful of an Africa that no longer bowed to the role of client, but stood as competitor. Inside Burkina Faso, however, hope was stubborn. Farmers who once saw their future only in migration now spoke of building factories at home. Women who once waited in lines for aid now chaired cooperatives that exported oil and flour. Children who once sketched planes dropping bombs now drew trucks delivering seeds. The transformation was not just in economics, but in imagination. And yet the questions remain. Was this truly a sustainable reform, or was it a daring gamble that might crumble under the next drought? Is President Ibrahim Traore a visionary reshaping the destiny of his nation, or is he a gambler betting the last reserves of trust on one dramatic gesture? More importantly, if this revolution falters, what will it mean for the millions who dared to believe again? For those of us watching from afar, the story does not belong only to Burkina Faso. It speaks to something universal, the idea that dignity begins when people are given the chance to plant, to work, and to eat from their own soil. The idea that leadership can mean placing seeds into the hands of the forgotten, not speeches into the air. The idea that sovereignty is measured not in foreign aid packages, but in harvests that feed children at night. So I ask you, do you think that President Ibrahim Traore's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Can we continue to trust him, or should another step forward to carry the vision? And if we doubt him, are we doubting the man, or the very possibility of bottom-up change itself? If you believe, then the world deserves to know stories beyond the headlines, stories of people who reclaim their dignity without permission. Subscribe now. If you feel that you are one of the first to see the bigger picture, one of the few who truly support the rise of a self-reliant Africa, share this video. Because what began as 5,000 tons of maize delivered by trucks across dusty roads may in the end prove to be far more than an agricultural program. It may be the seed of a new kind of power rooted not in weapons, not in foreign aid, but in people in soil and in the simple act of planting hope. Or was it a daring gamble that might crumble? On September 7th, 17th, 2025 at exactly 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the world changed and many didn't even notice. In a moment that may one day fill the pages of history books, a young African leader stood before the United Nations General Assembly and spoke words that echoed through decades of silence, injustice, and forgotten promises. Captain Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso, didn't plead. He didn't negotiate. He accused calmly, methodically, and with the weight of history on his shoulders. "I stand before you not as a supplicant seeking Western approval," he declared, "but as the voice of 1.4 billion Africans who refuse to accept that this United Nations serves anyone but the same colonial powers that have exploited our continent for centuries." Some called it the most explosive UN speech in modern history. Others described it as a diplomatic earthquake. But for those who were truly listening, it was more than that. It was a warning, a demand, a reckoning. President Traore demanded $847 billion in reparations from France for decades of colonial exploitation, dollar by dollar, resource by resource, contract by contract. And he didn't stop there. He issued an ultimatum. If justice was denied, Africa would walk out, not just from the room, but from the entire post-war international system. For 12 full minutes, 32 African delegations stood and applauded. The global South, including China, Russia, India, and Brazil, joined in. Meanwhile, Western diplomats sat frozen, unmoving, unprepared. As Americans especially, those of us who've witnessed the rise and fall of empires, wars, civil rights movements, and the reshaping of nations, we've learned to read the signs. We know when something big is brewing. We know when old systems begin to tremble. And we know how dangerous silence can be when truth is finally spoken. So let me ask you this, because if Captain Ibrahim Traore is right, then the world we built after World War II is not just outdated. It may already be collapsing. And the question we face isn't just what happens next, but whether we are ready for it. The United Nations General Assembly has seen countless speeches. Most are routine. Some are bold, but rarely does one speech redraw the lines of global politics in real time. On September 17th, 2025, President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso did just that. He walked to the podium not as a politician chasing approval, but as a soldier with a mission. Dressed in his uniform, standing tall before the representatives of nearly every nation on earth. He looked more like a man about to lead troops into battle than a diplomat about to deliver a speech. But perhaps that was the point. What followed over the next 47 minutes was not a speech. It was an indictment, and for many it was long overdue. With a calm, deliberative voice, Traore declared that the United Nations had failed not only Africa, but the entire global South. He accused the organization of legitimizing colonialism by giving power to the very countries that had for centuries extracted wealth from the developing world. He pointed directly at the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, calling them out by name: the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, China. He reminded the world that these powers still hold veto authority, a privilege earned not through democratic principles, but by winning a war in 1945. Then he turned to the focus of his message, France. With detailed documentation prepared by African economists and international legal experts, Traore outlined how France had extracted an estimated $847 billion from Burkina Faso since 1960. This number was not symbolic. It was precise. It accounted for stolen resources, unfair trade deals, and the forced monetary controls imposed by the CFA franc system. He explained how for decades Burkina Faso had been required to deposit half of its foreign reserves into the French treasury, how French corporations bought African resources at artificially low prices and sold them back as finished goods, how cotton, gold, and uranium left African soil only to return as profit for European shareholders. This is not partnership, Traore said. said. This is plunder with diplomatic cover. I formally demand that this General Assembly establish a reparations tribunal with binding authority to order France to compensate Burkina Faso for 6 decades of systematic exploitation. Translators paused. Heads turned, and then the warning. African countries will have no choice but to withdraw from institutions that legitimize our continued exploitation. Then 32 African delegations stood up in unison and began to applaud. 12 minutes of uninterrupted standing ovation followed. Delegates from China, Russia, India, and Brazil joined in. So did Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea. The Western Bloc remained seated, stunned and silent. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, sitting just feet from Traore, appeared visibly shaken. The carefully managed decorum of the UN chamber had been shattered. A red line had been crossed. This was not symbolic protest. This was a formal confrontation. Traore's tone was never angry. It was resolute. His words carried the kind of weight that comes not from volume, but from moral certainty. There was no shouting, no grand theatrics, just fact after fact laid bare before the world. This was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about Africa, about the global South, about centuries of silence being broken not by weapons, but by words. And yet his words hit like artillery. The $847 billion figure did more than shock. It gave the demand legitimacy. It made it real, tangible. It turned the abstract idea of colonial injustice into something measurable and actionable. In just under an hour, Captain Ibrahim Traore had done what generations of African leaders had long attempted. He made the global system look at itself in the mirror and ask whether it still represented justice or simply the survival of power. And for the first time in decades, the United Nations General Assembly wasn't just listening. It was trembling. After President Ibrahim Traore left the podium, the room did not return to normal. The thunderous 12-minute standing ovation echoed like a rebellion in slow motion. It wasn't just applause. It was a declaration of solidarity, a political earthquake. Delegations from across Africa stood without hesitation. But what sent shockwaves through the diplomatic world was the response from nations outside the continent. China's ambassador clapped steadily, nodding with visible approval. Russia's foreign minister stood with folded hands and a calm face. Brazil, India, and several Southeast Asian countries followed suit. This was not a fringe movement. It was the global South standing as one. The silence from the Western Bloc was equally powerful. Delegates from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany remained seated. Their faces were stoic but uneasy. For once, they were not in control of the narrative. For once, they had no rebuttal ready. No prepared statement could undo what had just been said. No diplomatic smile could conceal the discomfort. And that discomfort quickly turned into quiet panic behind closed doors. Within hours of Traore's speech, Western diplomatic teams were seen rushing through corridors, phones pressed to ears, emails firing across embassies. Emergency briefings were held. A special session with UN leadership was quietly scheduled. The question was clear. Could this lead to a mass exodus of African nations from the United Nations system? The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, issued a carefully worded statement the next day. He called for dialogue and mutual understanding, but his tone lacked confidence. It sounded more like damage control than leadership. Meanwhile, African media outlets erupted in praise. Pan-African headlines called Traore a new Sankara. Social media was flooded with clips of the speech, millions of views in hours. In Ouagadougou, thousands gathered in public squares to watch replays on large screens. Flags waved. People wept. Chants of 847 billion rang through the air. But the energy was not limited to Africa. In Caracas, in Tehran, in Hanoi, and even in New Delhi, public intellectuals and government spokespeople began to echo Traore's sentiment. Discussions about reparations, institutional bias, and Western double standards surfaced across forums and editorials. The global South had found not just a moment, but a message. That message was clear. The era of quiet compliance was over. On the diplomatic front, things escalated quickly. 32 African nations co-signed a resolution calling for the creation of the Reparations Tribunal. China publicly declared that the current United Nations structure no longer reflects the realities of 2025. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov described Traore's proposal as an important step toward multipolar global governance. India said it was time to consider serious reform or create alternatives. The United States Secretary of State issued a cautious statement suggesting that divisive rhetoric undermines global cooperation. France outright rejected the demand, calling it baseless and historically inaccurate. The United Kingdom echoed this sentiment. Germany suggested reforms should occur within the current system, not through parallel structures. But none of them addressed the $847 billion. None of them offered counter numbers. None challenged the data or denied the mechanisms of exploitation. Their silence on specifics spoke louder than their general rebuttals. Then came the strategic pushback. Western institutions began working behind the scenes to undermine the momentum. Diplomatic pressure was quietly applied to several African and Latin American governments. Aid packages were reviewed, investment deals delayed. Loans from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank were suddenly under reassessment. Leading Western newspapers and think tanks began publishing op-eds questioning Traore's credibility. Articles framed his proposals as unrealistic populism or ideological theater. Some hinted at foreign influence, backing Burkina Faso's sudden rise in visibility. Others tried to downplay the speech as symbolic frustration with no real consequences. But this time the narrative didn't hold. For too long, African leaders had been dismissed as idealists when they challenged the world order. But Traore wasn't speaking in vague terms. He had presented a legal framework, a financial case, and a diplomatic strategy. It was all documented. It was all quantifiable. And perhaps most important of all, he wasn't alone. The global applause had been loud, but the silence of the West, that was deafening. The ripple effect of President Ibrahim Traore's speech did not stay confined within the halls of the United Nations. It surged across borders and oceans, transforming what had started as a political statement into a continental awakening. In Burkina Faso, the streets of Ouagadougou filled with celebration. Crowds gathered in public squares, waving flags, shouting slogans, and playing replays of the speech on loudspeakers. For many, this wasn't just a victory for their president, it was personal. For decades, they had watched foreign companies extract their gold, their cotton, their uranium, while schools remained underfunded and hospitals under-equipped. Now someone had finally named the theft and demanded the bill. Local newspapers in French and indigenous languages printed front-page headlines like "The Day Africa Spoke" and 847 billion reasons to rise. Older citizens compared the energy in the air to the days of Thomas Sankara. Younger citizens took to social media, calling Traore the voice of a new generation of African dignity. But Burkina Faso was just the beginning. In Mali and Niger, governments officially declared their support for Traore's proposal and pledged participation in the upcoming Global South Assembly Conference scheduled for December 15th in Ouagadougou. Leaders from Chad, Guinea, and the Central African Republic issued statements of solidarity emphasizing that Africa's time has come. The Alliance of Sahel States, a regional coalition formed in recent years between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, saw a surge in popularity. Citizens from all three countries began to view the alliance not just as a defense pact, but as the nucleus of a new African-centered geopolitical identity. Meanwhile, in South Africa, students organized teach-ins about reparations and economic sovereignty. In Nigeria, prominent lawmakers demanded a full audit of French and British economic influence in the region. Ghana's president addressed the nation and stated Africa must speak with one voice.
Your day and your season of recovery is here. In Jesus' name, I pray safety for all of your journeys. I pray God's supernatural protection and the ministry of angels for your journeys in the name of Jesus Christ. And I pray God's protection around your family. I pray solid health for you in the name of Jesus Christ. We all agree in faith in the name of Jesus. If there is any sickness or any disease on anyone, that the power that raised Christ from death engages your body right now, will remove those sicknesses and diseases. Receive your healing in the name of Jesus Christ. All right. In this time, we're very clear about the assignment that God gave us. It's to raise role models, people who will be so transformed by God that they will become examples to others. That's what we mean. And our ultimate role model is Jesus Christ. So we're raising people who have the character, the competence, and the capacity and the courage of Jesus Christ. This Star Christian Center is filled with schools. We are serious about this assignment that God has given us to raise leaders. Because role models are leaders, right, in the society. So we have schools. And the first one we encourage you to take part in is the Daystar Leadership Academy.